On a Thursday morning in January of 1998, at a bridge construction site on the Allegheny River 7 miles north of Pittsburgh, a site supervisor named Tom Delvecchio stood on a frozen riverbank and watched his career sink into the water. 4 days earlier, a crane operator had been positioning a 60-foot steel girder when the crane's outrigger pad punched through what the soil engineers promised was stable ground. The crane tipped the boom, swung toward the river, and 80 tons of machinery went over the edge. Now the crane sat half submerged in 12 feet of freezing water, its counterweight above the surface like a drowning man's reaching hand, its boom buried 4 feet deep in river-bottom mud. The construction project was stopped. The bridge contract was in jeopardy, and Tom had no idea how to get the crane out. The river didn't care about deadlines. It didn't care about contracts or careers or the 40 men standing behind Tom with nothing to do but watch their jobs disappear into cold water. The river just kept moving steady and patient the way rivers always moved, taking what they could pull down and holding it until someone figured out how to pull it back. Tom Delvecchio was 52 years old. He'd spent 23 years building Delvecchio Construction from a two-man operation with a used backhoe into a company that employed 40 people and bid on bridge contracts worth millions. 23 years of 16-hour days and 7-day weeks. 23 years of putting everything he had into concrete and steel in the belief that if you worked hard enough and smart enough, you could build something that lasted. Now he stood on a frozen riverbank in January, watching 80 tons of his company's equipment sit in water cold enough to kill a man in minutes, and all those years felt like they were sinking right along with the crane. The morning air bit at his face with that particular kind of January cold that came off water and settled into bone. The kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your eyes water. The kind that reminded you that winter in Pittsburgh was serious business, that the rivers here had been cutting through rock for thousands of years and didn't care if you were standing on their banks having a bad week. Behind Tom, the construction site stretched out like a frozen battlefield. The steel framework of the bridge's eastern pier rose 30 feet into gray sky, stopped mid-build, waiting for the crane that sat submerged 100 feet from where Tom stood. Concrete barriers lined the access road, marking the path heavy equipment took from the staging area to the worksite. Equipment sat idle under tarps covered against the weather, but useless without the crane to lift in position. 40 men on payroll with nothing to do but wait and watch and wonder if they'd still have jobs by the end of the month. Tom knew most of them by name, knew which ones had kids in college and which ones were supporting elderly parents, knew who was a month behind on mortgage payments and who just bought a new truck he couldn't afford to lose, knew that when this company went under, and it would go under, if they couldn't recover the crane, 40 families would feel it. The crane operator, Jimmy Reese, stood near Tom, now silent and miserable. Jimmy was 38, had been operating cranes for Delvecchio Construction for 12 years. Good operator, careful. Not his fault the ground gave way. The soil engineers had marked that spot as stable, had done core samples, had certified the load-bearing capacity, had been wrong. "I'm sorry, Tom," Jimmy said, for probably the 20th time that morning. "I swear I positioned it exactly where they marked." "I know," Tom said. "This isn't on you, Jimmy." But Jimmy looked like a man who'd killed someone anyway. Looked like he hadn't slept since Monday, when he'd felt the crane tip and had jumped clear just before 80 tons of machinery went into the Allegheny River. Marcus Webb, Tom's site foreman, walked over. Marcus was 48, built like a fire hydrant, with hands like catcher's mitts and a face that had seen every kind of construction disaster there was. He'd been with Tom for 18 years, had helped build Delvecchio Construction from almost nothing into what it was now. "Glenn's coming at 2, Marcus said. His breath came out in white clouds. "Called 20 minutes ago. Says he needs to see the situation before he makes his determination. Glenn Wickham, the insurance adjuster. Coming to look at the crane in the river and declare it a total loss and send Tom's company a bill for equipment they no longer own but still owed $200,000 on. He's already made his determination," Tom said. "He's just coming to make it official." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, the Hartman crew tried again this morning. Tom had watched, had stood on this same spot 2 hours ago, and watched Hartman Recovery position their biggest crane, a 200-ton hydraulic monster that cost more than Tom's house. State-of-the-art, computer-controlled load management, automatic leveling, precise load sensors, the kind of equipment that made recovery work look easy when conditions were right. Conditions weren't right. Every time they tried to position the recovery crane close enough to get a proper pull angle on the submerged equipment, the outriggers started sinking into soft earth. Not fast, not dramatic, just slowly, steadily settling into ground that looked solid, but wasn't. Ground that had been softened by winter thaw and river seepage and the vibration from construction equipment over the past 3 months. The crane's weight, the very power that should have pulled the submerged equipment free, became its own enemy. They couldn't get close enough to the water to make the pull without risking putting a 200-ton recovery crane into the river next to the crane they were trying to save. Same result, Tom asked. Ground won't hold, Marcus confirmed. They tried approaching from 3 different angles. Every spot within working distance is too soft. Tom had known it would be. Had known it yesterday when Hartman first arrived. Had known it Tuesday when he'd walked the bank and felt the earth give under his boots. But he'd let them try anyway because what else could he do? You didn't give up just because something looked impossible. You tried. You kept trying until you ran out of options. He was running out of options. The diving company had sent men down Tuesday afternoon, professional salvage divers who specialized in equipment recovery. They'd gone into water that was 34 degrees, wearing dry suits and tethered to safety lines, and they'd spent 40 minutes assessing the situation while Tom stood on the bank and watched their bubbles break the surface. When they came up, their report wasn't encouraging. The crane's boom was buried 4 feet into river mud, not sitting on top of the mud, buried in it, driven down by the weight and the current, and 4 days of the river trying to pull it deeper. The boom had punched into the soft river bottom like a knife into butter, and now the mud had closed around it, creating suction that would fight any attempt to pull it free. The current was strong, not whitewater rapid strong, but steady and powerful the way big rivers moved. The Allegheny here was maybe 200 feet across and 12 feet deep at the submerged crane's location. All that water moving past created force. Force that pushed against anything trying to stay still. Force that would fight any recovery operation. Water temperature was holding at 34 degrees, cold enough that the divers could only work in short intervals before hypothermia became a risk. Cold enough that if anything went wrong, if someone ended up in that water without protection, they'd have maybe 15 minutes before the cold killed them. The crane sat at an angle boom pointing downstream, counterweight upstream. The weight of the boom was pulling the whole assembly toward the river bottom. The counterweight was the only thing keeping it from rolling over completely and disappearing into the mud. Rigging a lift would take a week minimum. That's what the dive supervisor had said. A week to get cables positioned, a week to build a stable platform for a recovery crane, a week of fighting current and cold and mud, and no guarantees, no promises that after a week of work and expense, they'd be able to pull the crane free. Tom didn't have a week. The bridge contract had penalty clauses for delays. $5,000 per day after the scheduled completion date. They were already 3 days behind. If the crane recovery took a week, that was another 7 days. 10 days total. $50,000 in penalties. But penalties weren't the real problem. The real problem was that delays gave the State Transportation Authority the right to terminate the contract and award it to another company. And Tom knew there were 3 other construction companies in Pittsburgh who'd bid on this bridge. 3 other companies who'd love to take over a half-finished project and collect the remaining payments. Losing this contract meant losing $2 million in revenue, meant having to lay off 30 of his 40 employees, meant probably having to close Del Vecchio construction entirely because the company couldn't survive losing that much money. 23 years of work. Gone. Tom's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, saw his wife's name on the screen. Sarah. He let it go to voicemail. What could he tell her? That she'd been right all along, that he'd sacrificed their marriage for a company that was dying anyway. Sarah had left last month, walked out after 26 years of marriage, said she was tired of being married to it all instead of a man, tired of him leaving before dawn and coming home after dark, tired of weekends spent on construction sites, tired of vacations canceled because of project deadlines, tired of feeling like she came in second to concrete and steel and the constant, relentless drive to build the company bigger and better and more successful. She put her wedding ring on the kitchen table between them on a Tuesday night in December. Tom remembered it exactly. Had been sitting at that table eating leftover pizza because he'd gotten home at 9 and Sarah had eaten dinner hours earlier. The ring had made a small sound when she set it down, a tiny click of gold against wood. "I want a divorce," she'd said, calm, decided, like she'd been thinking about it for years, which she probably had. Tom had stared at the ring. "Sarah, don't. I don't want apologies. I don't want promises that you'll change. I've heard those promises for 20 years and nothing ever changes. You love this company more than you love me. That's just the truth. And I can't do this anymore." She'd left that night, packed 2 suitcases and drove to her sister's house in Cranberry Township. Had filed for divorce on January 2nd. Tom had the papers in his truck now. Had been carrying them around for 2 weeks unsigned, like if he didn't sign them, maybe it wasn't real. Maybe none of this was real. Maybe he'd wake up and it would be 3 months ago before the crane went in the river, before Sarah left, before everything started falling apart. The phone buzzed again. Sarah again. Tom let it go to voicemail again. Marcus was watching him. "You should answer that." "Not now." "Tom." "I said not now, Marcus." Marcus nodded and walked away. He'd worked with Tom long enough to know when to push and when to leave things alone. Tom turned back to the river. The crane's counterweight caught weak January sun metal gleaming dully above water that didn't care about Tom's problems or his failing marriage or the 40 men who needed their oars or the 23 years he'd spent building something that was crumbling. The river just kept moving, cold and patient and ready to take whatever it could pull down. Tom's phone rang a third time. Different number. Unknown. Tom almost didn't answer. He was standing on a riverbank watching his career end. He didn't have time for sales calls or wrong numbers or whatever an unknown caller wanted. But something made him answer. Maybe desperation. Maybe the knowledge that things couldn't get much worse. Maybe just the need to do something, anything other than stand here and watch. "Delvecchio," he said. "Mr. Delvecchio." The voice was old, rough like gravel, worn smooth in places and sharp in others. The kind of voice that came from decades of breathing mill dust and shouting over the sound of machinery. The flat vowels of Pittsburgh's working neighborhoods, the kind of accent that was disappearing as the mills closed and the old-timers died off. "My name is Ed Kokalchik. I worked at Jones and Laughlin Steel for 42 years. I heard about your crane in the river." Tom closed his eyes, of course. Word had gotten around. Probably half of Pittsburgh had heard about the crane in the river by now. And here came someone calling to sell him recovery services he couldn't afford. "If you're calling to sell me equipment or services, I appreciate it, but I've already got Hartman Recovery here with everything they can throw at this, and it's not working. The ground won't support." "I'm not selling anything," the old voice interrupted. "I'm offering to help. I've got a wrecker, old one but built for this kind of work. If you want, I can bring it out and take a look." A wrecker. Tom opened his eyes and looked at the 200-ton Hartman crane sitting idle on the access road, at the recovery crew standing around with nothing to do because the ground wouldn't hold their equipment. "Sir, I appreciate the call, I do, but we've got Hartman Recovery here with a 200-ton hydraulic crane, and they can't position safely. The ground along the riverbank is too soft. Modern equipment can't get close enough to pull without risking—" "Your modern crane's too heavy," Ed said. Simple. Factual. Needs solid ground to anchor on. Big outriggers, lots of pressure on small points. That ground's been soaked by river seepage and winter thaw. Can't handle point loads that big. Your crane's trying to work from where the ground won't hold it." Tom looked at the Hartman crane, at the outrigger pads that had started sinking every time they tried to position close to the water. The old man wasn't wrong about the problem, but that didn't mean he had a solution. "Okay, so the ground's soft, that's the problem. How does having an older wrecker help?" "Mine's different," Ed said. "Lighter frame, spreads the load. Taller boom means I can work from farther back where the ground's stable. Don't need to get close to the water if the boom's tall enough to reach." "What kind of wrecker are we talking about?" "Autocar, 1948. Custom boom. My father built it for mill work and river recoveries." 1948. Tom did the math. 50 years old, half a century. This was what his career had come to, listening to an old man with antique equipment offer to do what modern machinery with computer controls and hydraulic power and load sensors couldn't do. Mr. Kokalchik, Ed. Ed, that crane in the river weighs 80 tons. The recovery company is telling me they need a week just to rig a safe pole, and they've got modern equipment designed for this exact kind of work. You're talking about equipment that's 50 years old. How could that possibly? I pulled trucks out of the Allegheny in the 60s, Ed said. His voice had the kind of certainty that didn't come from arrogance or salesmanship. It came from experience, from doing something so many times that you stopped thinking about it and just knew. Pulled equipment out of this exact stretch of river when the mills were running. I know that riverbank, know where the bedrock is under the topsoil, know how the current works, know where the seepage comes from, and where the ground stays stable. Tom opened his mouth to refuse, to thank the old man politely and hang up, to get back to watching his company die. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the certainty in Ed's voice. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the knowledge that he had an insurance adjuster coming at 2 o'clock to write off the crane and send him a bill that would bankrupt the company. What did he have to lose? All right, Tom said. Come take a look. Can't hurt to have another set of eyes on it. But I need to be straight with you. I probably can't pay much. We're already over budget on recovery costs. And if this crane's a total loss, we're looking at... I'm not asking to be paid, Ed said. Tom stopped. What? I'm not asking for money, Mr. Del Vecchio. I'm offering to help, that's all. Why would you do that? Because you need help, and I might be able to give it. That's reason enough. Before Tom could respond, the line went dead. Ed had hung up. Tom stood holding his phone, staring at it like it might explain what just happened. An old man with a 50-year-old wrecker was coming to try what modern equipment couldn't do. For free. Because Tom needed help. It was the strangest phone call Tom had received in his life. Marcus had walked back over during the conversation. Who was that guy who says he can pull the crane, P? What company? Not a company. Just a guy. Says he's got a wrecker. Old one. Says his father built it. Marcus stared at Tom, then laughed. It came out sharp and bitter, the kind of laugh that had nothing to do with humor. Jesus, Tom, you're that desperate? Tom looked at his foreman, at the man who'd worked beside him for 18 years, who'd helped him build this company, who'd been there through every crisis and every success and every long night when they were trying to finish a job on time. Yeah, Marcus, Tom said quietly. I'm exactly that desperate. Marcus's smile faded. He nodded slowly. Okay, when's he coming? Don't know, he hung up before I could ask. What kind of record did he say it was? Autocar, 1948. Marcus whistled low. That's older than I am. Yeah. They stood in silence watching the crane in the river. Behind them, Tom's crew was standing around in clusters, drinking coffee from thermoses, stamping their feet against the cold, talking in low voices about what would happen if the company went under. Tom's phone buzzed again. Sarah. Third call this morning. This time Tom answered. Hi. Tom, finally, I've been trying to reach you for an hour. Sarah's voice was tight, stressed. We need to talk about the divorce papers. I'm kind of in the middle of something right now. You're always in the middle of something. That's the problem. Tom, my lawyer, says you haven't signed the papers yet. It's been 2 weeks. You need to sign them so we can move forward with... Sarah, I can't do this right now. I'm standing on a riverbank watching our company die. Can we talk about this tonight? It's not our company. It's your company. That's the whole point. That's why I left. Tom closed his eyes. I know you're right. Can we please talk about this later? Silence on the line. Then Sarah said something that surprised him. Is it really that bad? The company... The crane's been in the river for 4 days. Recovery company can't pull wet. Insurance is coming this afternoon to declare it a total loss. If that happens, we lose the bridge contract and probably have to close. So yeah, it's that bad. More silence. Then softer. I'm sorry, Tom. Yeah, me too. Call me tonight. I will. Sarah hung up. Tom put his phone away and turned back to the river. The water kept moving, carrying pieces of ice downstream, flowing around the submerged crane like it had all the time in the world. Because it did have all the time in the world. Rivers didn't worry about deadlines or contracts or marriages falling apart. They just flowed, patient and relentless and absolutely certain that eventually everything ended up in their current. Tom wondered if the river would still be here after his company was gone, after his marriage was over, after everyone standing on this bank today had moved on to other deeds or other towns or other lives. Of course it would. Rivers outlasted everything. The sound of an engine made Tom turn. A truck was coming down the access road. Not one of the construction vehicles, not the Hartman equipment, something else, something old. Ed Kokalchik sat in his kitchen with the phone still warm in his hand and felt his heart do something it hadn't done in 7 years. It felt useful. 73 years old, and Ed had forgotten what that feeling was like. Not needed. Nobody needed a man his age for anything important anymore. The world had moved on to computers and modern machinery and young men who knew how to operate equipment Ed had never even seen. Nobody called an old mill worker for help with anything that mattered. But useful, capable of doing something that made a difference. That was different. That was what Ed had felt when he'd heard Tom Del Vecchio's voice on the phone, heard the desperation underneath the professional tone, heard a man drowning and looking for something to grab onto. Ed could be that something. The Autocar could be that something. The kitchen around him was small and neat, worn the way houses got when one person lived in them for decades. The same Formica table Stefan had built in 1962, its surface marked by years of use, a cigarette burned near one corner from a night in '73 when Ed had fallen into sleep reading the paper. The same wooden cabinets Mary had painted yellow in '79, 2 years before the cancer took her. The paint now faded and chipped, but still holding on. The same linoleum floor cream with blue flecks installed in '68, worn thin in front of the sink and stove. This house had been his and Mary's for 42 years. They'd bought it in 1966 with a VA loan, Ed having served 2 years in Korea before the steel mill. Small house, 1,200 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely big enough for the table, and a living room where the TV sat in one corner and Mary's reading chair sat in the other. Mary had died in that reading chair. November of '91. The cancer had eaten her down to nothing over 8 months, and at the end, she'd wanted to be in her chair with a view of the backyard where the maple tree turned colors in the fall. Ed had sat on the floor next to her, holding her hand, and when she finally let go, it had been quiet, peaceful, like she was just tired of fighting. The house had felt enormous after that. Empty in a way Ed didn't know a house could feel. He'd kept everything exactly the way Mary had left it. Her chair still sat by the window. Her books still lined the shelf Ed had built for her 40th birthday. Her coffee mug, the one with the flowers she'd bought at a yard sale in '84, still sat in the cabinet next to Ed's. 7 years now. 7 years of living in a house built for 2 people, eating at a table built for family dinners that never happened anymore, sleeping on one side of a bed because the other side was Mary's and always would be. 7 years of being alone. The radio on the kitchen windowsill crackled with scanner traffic. Ed had bought a police scanner in '92, the year after Mary died. Had set it to scan emergency frequencies, fire department paramedics, construction companies. Listened to it every morning with his coffee. It made the house feel less empty. Voices talking about work that needed doing. Problems that needed solving. A world that kept moving even when your part of it had stopped. This morning, the scanner had brought him Tom Del Vecchio's name. Ed had been scrambling eggs the way Mary used to make them, firm, but not hard, with black pepper and just enough salt when he'd heard the call. Hartman recovery to dispatcher requesting additional equipment for the Del Vecchio construction crane recovery on the Allegheny. Equipment couldn't position safely. Ground too soft. Needed engineering consultation on alternate approaches. Ed had stopped with the spatula halfway to the plate. Del Vecchio construction. Crane in the river. Ground too soft. He knew that riverbank. Had pulled equipment from the Allegheny dozens of times in the '60s and '70s when the mills were running full and men were working heavy machinery near water and accidents happened. Knew exactly where the topsoil ended and bedrock began. Knew where the seepage came from, how the water table rose in winter, where you could anchor safely even when everything looked unstable. And he knew something else. Knew that modern recovery companies with their 200-ton cranes and their computer load management systems approach problems with power, with the assumption that if you had enough lifting capacity and enough hydraulic force, you could muscle anything out of anywhere. But the riverbank along the Allegheny wasn't about power. It was about understanding, about reading the ground, about working with physics instead of trying to overwhelm it. Stefan's Autocar was built for exactly that kind of work. Ed had looked out the kitchen window at the garage, at the building that had housed the Autocar for 50 years, at the truck his father had built by hand, and Ed had kept running through sheer stubborn determination not to let Stefan's work die. 7 years since the last job. 7 years of the Autocar sitting silent, except for the twice-yearly startups Ed performed to keep the engine from seizing. 7 years of Ed wondering if he'd ever use Stefan's wrecker again, or if it would just sit in that garage until Ed died and someone hauled it away for scrap. 7 years of being useless. Ed had turned off the stove, had called directory assistance for Delvecchio Construction's number, had dialed, and when a machine answered, had asked for the site supervisor's mobile number. The secretary, probably sensing something in Ed's voice, had given it to him. And now Ed sat in his kitchen phone, still warm in his hand eggs, getting cold on the counter, and felt useful for the first time since Mary died. The Autocar could still work. Ed could still work. There was a job that needed doing, and Ed had the tools to do it. He stood joints protesting. 73 years old, and his body reminded him of it every morning. His knees ached from decades of climbing it on equipment and kneeling on concrete. His back remembered every long shift in the mills, every time he'd lifted something too heavy or twisted wrong, or worked through the pain because the job needed finishing. His hands were swollen with arthritis, the knuckles enlarged, the fingers not quite as flexible as they used to be. But they still worked, still knew how to tie a knot, how to thread a shackle, how to feel tension in a cable, and know when to pull and when to wait. Ed walked to the closet near the front door, found his heavy canvas coat, brown and stained with decades of grease and oil. Found his work boots, steel-toed Red Wings he'd bought in '89, the leather so worn and oil-soaked it had gone almost black. Found his tool belt, the one Stefan had made in '54s from leather salvaged from the mill, stitched and riveted by hand worn smooth from 40 years of use. Mary used to say Ed looked like a ghost of the old Pittsburgh when he put on that work gear. Said he looked like he was stepping back into 1960, back into a world where men built things with their hands and fixed things that broke and didn't throw anything away just because it was old. Ed had always taken that as a compliment. He put on the coat and boots, buckled the tool belt around his waist, felt the familiar weight of it, the tools settled into their worn places. Hammer on the left hip, pliers and wire cutters on the right, shackles and carabiners hanging from D-rings. Everything exactly where it had been for decades, where his hands could find them without looking. Then Ed walked out the back door to the garage. The garage was detached, sitting at the back of the small lot, a simple two-car structure with a peaked roof and two large doors that swung open on hinges. Stefan had built it in 1953, the same year Ed started at the mill. Built it specifically to house the Autocar and have room to work on it. Ed pulled open the doors. They moved easily, the hinges Ed had oiled just last month turning smooth. Gray January light fell into the garage, illuminating the shape that had sat there for 7 years. The Autocar DC-100. It sat in shadows, massive and angular, looking like something from another era because it was. The truck was from a time when equipment was built to last, when planned obsolescence wasn't a concept, when men made things by hand because they needed tools that would work for decades. The cab was boxy industrial, all straight lines and flat panels. No curves, no aerodynamics, not designed to look good, designed to work. The paint was faded dark green, the original color from when Stefan had first assembled the truck, though it had been repainted twice over the years. Patches of rust showed through at the edges, particularly around the wheel wells and along the bottom of the doors, but the rust was surface only. The frame underneath was solid steel, heavy gauge, built to carry weight and take abuse. Behind the cab rose the boom, 24 feet of welded I-beam vertical like a flagpole or a radio tower. Stefan's design, Stefan's work. Ed walked around to look at it from the side the way he always did when he came to the garage. The boom was constructed from scrap steel Stephen had salvaged from the mill pieces cut and fitted and welded with the skill of a man who'd spent his life working metal. The welds were clean, perfect really, smooth beads laid down with steady hands and an eye for precision. Stefan had been a welder at J&L Steel for 30 years before he retired, had learned the trade in Poland before the war had brought that knowledge to America in 1938 when he'd fled with nothing but the clothes on his back and the skills in his head. Those wells had held for 50 years, would hold for 50 more if anyone kept the truck running that long. Ed walked slowly around the autocar, checking everything the way he always did. Tires first. They were old, the rubber cracking slightly, but they held air and the tread was still good. These weren't highway tires. These were industrial tires, solid and thick, designed for slow work on rough ground. Ed kept them inflated to exactly 40 pounds. Stefan had taught him that. 40 pounds for stability without sacrificing grip. Frame rails next. Ed knelt his knees, protesting, and looked underneath. The steel was solid, heavy gauge, no cracks, no serious corrosion. Just surface rust in places, the kind that showed the metal had been worked hard but was still strong. Stefan had reinforced these rails when he'd built the boom, had added cross bracing and gussets, because he knew the stress of heavy pulls would try to twist the frame. The boom itself Ed saved for last. He stood in front of it looking up at the 24 feet of I-beam that made Stefan's design unique. Most recovery trucks used hydraulic booms that extended and retracted, that could change angle and length. Flexible, adaptable, modern. Stefan's boom was fixed. Couldn't move, or couldn't change angle, just stood there vertical 24 feet tall, which was exactly why it worked. A fixed boom meant all the engineering was simple. No hydraulic cylinders to fail, no pivot points to maintain, no complicated angles to calculate. The boom stood straight up and the cable ran over a pulley at the top, and that was it. Simple, reliable, impossible to break. And 24 feet of height meant Ed could position the autocar far back from a recovery site anchor on solid ground and still get the steep angle needed to lift or pull effectively. Modern recovery cranes with their extendable booms had to get close to maintain capacity, had to position near the load. Stefan's fixed tower meant Ed could stay back where it was safe and let the height do the work. Ed had watched his father design this system, had been 17 years old in the summer of '48, watching Stefan work in this garage every evening after his shift at the mill. Watched him calculate angles with a pencil and paper. Watched him weld the boom pieces together. Watched him explain why a fixed tower was better than a pivot boom for certain kinds of work. Most people think recovery is about power, Eddie, Stefan had said one evening, his hands black with soot from the mill, his welding mask pushed up on his head. Think you need biggest crane, most lifting capacity. But power without position is useless. Better to have less power from right position than more power from wrong position. Ed had nodded, not really understanding. Stefan had smiled. You'll see. When you do this work, you'll see. It's not about strong, it's about smart. 50 years later, standing in the garage, looking at his father's work, Ed understood. He opened the driver's door. It creaked on hinges that needed oil. The cab smelled like old vinyl and metal, and oil and exhaust, the smell of machinery that had worked hard. The seat was cracked, the vinyl patched with duct tape in 3 places. The steering wheel was worn smooth, the original covering gone in spots where hands had gripped it for decades. The dashboard was simple, just the basics: oil pressure gauge, water temperature, fuel level, ammeter, speedometer, no electronics, no computers, no GPS or backup camera or parking sensors, just mechanical gauges connected to the engine by physical cables and hoses. Ed slid into the seat. It fit him the way it always had worn, to the shape of his body after decades of driving. He put his hands on the steering wheel, felt the familiar texture of worn metal and old rubber. The key was in the ignition, where Ed always left it. Who was going to steal a 50-year-old wrecker from a garage in Lawrenceville? Ed turned the key. The starter motor cranked. Once. Twice. The engine coughed, trying to catch. Ed waited. Didn't force it. The autocar didn't respond well to forcing. It responded to patience. On the fourth crank, the engine caught. It didn't purr, didn't hum smoothly. It rumbled, deep and mechanical, the sound of pistons the size of coffee cans moving in cast iron cylinders. The sound of a transmission built from gears cut on machines that didn't exist anymore. The sound of an engine designed to run all day at low speed under maximum load. The sound of Stefan's work still alive. Ed sat listening to it, feeling the vibration through the seat, through the steering wheel, through his whole body. The Autocar had been silent for 7 years, except for the brief startups twice a year to keep it alive. Now it was running for real. Running because there was work to do. Ed let it warm up. The temperature gauge crept slowly upward. The oil pressure gauge settled at 40 pounds. Everything normal, everything working exactly the way it should. Behind the cab, Ed could hear the slight creak and groan of the boom settling as the truck warmed. Metal expanding, settling into working position, getting ready. Ed shifted into reverse, released the parking brake, and backed the Autocar out of the garage into gray January daylight. The truck moved slowly. The Autocar didn't do fast. Its top speed was maybe 40 miles per hour on level ground, and that was pushing it. The transmission had 6 gears, all of them low, designed for torque instead of speed. First gear moved the truck at walking pace. Second gear at jogging pace. By sixth gear, you might hit 35 or 40 if the road was good and you had time. But Ed didn't need fast. He needed reliable. He needed a truck that could plant itself on questionable ground and not move. He needed a boom tall enough to reach from safety. He needed the knowledge Stefan had built into every weld and every bolt. He had all of that. Ed drove out of the garage and pointed the Autocar toward the street. Then he stopped, put it in neutral, and climbed out to close the garage doors. Took his time, made sure they were secured. You didn't leave things open and unsecured. That wasn't how you took care of equipment. When the doors were closed, Ed climbed back into the cab and started driving toward the address Tom Delvecchio had mentioned, 7 miles north on Route 28, along the river. Ed knew the area, had worked recovery jobs there in the 60s when the mills were running and barges moved up and down the Allegheny carrying steel and coal and raw materials. The drive from Ed's house in Lawrenceville to Route 28 took him through neighborhoods he'd known his whole life, past the corner store where he'd bought cigarettes in high school before he'd quit in '68 when Mary got pregnant with Michael, past the bar where he and Stefan used to drink Iron City on Friday nights after their shifts at the mill, past the church where he'd married Mary in '56, where they'd buried her in '91, where he'd probably be buried whenever his time came. Pittsburgh had changed so much since Ed was young. The mills were gone. The steel that had built this city, that had employed hundreds of thousands of men, that had made Pittsburgh synonymous with American industry, was gone. The buildings stood empty or torn down. The jobs were gone. The smoke that used to turn the sky gray was gone. Sometimes Ed missed the smoke, missed the certainty of it, missed knowing that when you woke up in the morning there would be work. Hard work, dangerous work, work that paid just enough to raise a family and own a house and maybe take a vacation once a year if you saved. But work, always work. Now the mills were closed and the smoke was gone, and Pittsburgh was trying to figure out what it was supposed to be without steel. Ed didn't know the answer to that question. He just knew he missed the old city sometimes. Missed the certainty of knowing what your role was, what you were supposed to do, how you fit in. Traffic was light. Ed kept the Autocar in the right lane, driving at 25 miles per hour, letting faster vehicles pass. Modern cars and trucks flew past him, their drivers glancing over, some staring, some laughing, some pointing. Ed ignored them. The Autocar didn't care what anyone thought of it, neither did Ed. He merged onto Route 28, heading north along the Allegheny. The river flowed on his right, gray and cold and steady. Ice clung to the banks in places. The water looked thick and slow, but Ed knew that was an illusion. The Allegheny moved with power even when it looked calm. Ed had fallen into this river once. 1963, winter like now. He'd been rigging a cable on a barge that had broken loose and run aground. The deck had been icy. Ed's boot had slipped, and he'd gone in wearing his heavy coat and work boots. The cold had hit him like a hammer, had driven the breath from his lungs, had made his muscles seize. He'd been underwater for maybe 5 seconds, and when he came up, he couldn't catch his breath, couldn't make his arms work right, couldn't think through the cold. Stefan had pulled him out, had reached down from the barge and grabbed Ed's coat and hauled him up like he weighed nothing. Had stripped Ed's wet clothes off and wrapped him in blankets and driven him home where Mary had run a hot bath and made him sit in water so hot it burned while his body remembered how to work. Never forget the river is stronger than you, Stefan had said later, sitting in Ed's kitchen drinking coffee while Ed recovered. River doesn't care you're cold, doesn't care you need to breathe. River just is. You respect it or it kills you. Ed had never forgotten that lesson. Now he drove alongside that same river, the autocar's engine rumbling steady, watching for the construction site markers. 7 miles north, should be coming up soon. The scanner on the passenger seat crackled. Ed had brought it with him habit from decades of keeping one in whichever vehicle he was driving. Sometimes scanner traffic told you things about a job site before you got there, told you what equipment was present, what problems people were having, what the situation really looked like beyond what the supervisor told you on the phone. The scanner was quiet now, just occasional traffic about unrelated incidents, nothing about the crane recovery. Ed drove steady, watching the road, watching the river, thinking about what he'd find when he got there. A crane in the river, 80 tons, Tom had said. Boom buried in mud. Recovery company can't position close enough to pull. Ed had pulled equipment from worse situations. Had pulled a coal truck from a collapsed mine shaft in '67, working from 200 feet back, using the autocar's boom height to reach. Had pulled a cement mixer that had rolled down an embankment in 72 rigging from above, because the ground below wouldn't hold. Had pulled barges and trucks and equipment Ed didn't even remember anymore because there had been so many jobs over so many years. But that was decades ago. Ed was 73 now. His body wasn't what it used to be. His strength wasn't what it used to be. He moved slower, tired faster, needed to be more careful because falling at 73 meant broken bones instead of bruises. Could he still do this work? Ed didn't know, but he was going to find out. The construction site appeared ahead on the right. Orange signs marked the access road. Construction equipment visible through the trees. Ed slowed, turned onto the access road, and felt the autocar's tires crunch on gravel, and felt every eye on the site turn toward him. The autocar rumbled down the access road like a ghost from another era, and every person on the Del Vecchio construction site stopped what they were doing and stared. Ed saw them staring, saw workers setting down coffee cups and thermoses, saw the Hartman recovery crew turn away from their own equipment to watch, saw Tom Del Vecchio standing near the river's edge turn around and shield his eyes against the weak January sun to see what was making that sound. The sound of an engine from 1948, deep and mechanical and utterly unlike anything modern. The sound of heavy iron and simple gears, and the kind of engineering that believed in making something once and making it right. Ed drove slowly through the site, navigating around concrete barriers and parked equipment. He could see the river now, see the crane's counterweight sticking up above the water like a steel monument to failure. Could see the Hartman recovery crane sitting idle on solid ground, its massive frame and hydraulic boom looking sleek and powerful, and completely useless for the task at hand. A few of the workers laughed as Ed passed. Not mean laughter exactly, but the kind of laughter that came from surprise and disbelief. One of them said something Ed couldn't hear, and the others laughed harder. Ed understood. The autocar looked ridiculous next to modern equipment. Looked like something that belonged in a museum, not on an active construction site. The cab was boxy where modern trucks were aerodynamic. The boom was a simple tower where modern cranes had complex hydraulic arms. The whole truck looked handmade because it was handmade. Ed parked near the gate away from the active work area and shut down the engine. The sudden silence felt profound. Then the wind filled it cold off the river, carrying the smell of water and mud in January cold. Ed sat in the cab for a moment, gathering himself. 73 years old, about to climb out in front of 40 men and try to convince them that this old truck could do what their modern equipment couldn't. About to prove that Stefan's engineering was still relevant 50 years after the man had welded the first beam. Ed opened the door and climbed down, moved carefully. 73-year-old joints didn't forgive carelessness. His knees complained. His back reminded him of all the times he'd lifted wrong or twisted wrong or worked through pain because the job needed finishing. But he got down safely and stood next to the autocar, one hand on the truck's frame, steadying himself. "Mr. Kokalchik, The man walking toward him had to be Tom Delvecchio, maybe 50, built solid with the look of someone who'd spent his life on construction sites. Tired eyes, worried face, the face of a man watching something important fall apart and not knowing how to stop it. Ed had seen that face before, on other men at other job sites when the situation looked impossible and the money was running out and the consequences of failure were adding up. Ed, he said, extending his hand. Tom shook it. His grip was strong, calloused. Working man's hands. You, Tom? Yeah, thanks for coming out. Tom looked past Ed at the autocar, and Ed saw something flicker across his face. Not quite doubt, not quite hope, something in between. That's your truck. That's her. 1948 Autocar DC-100. My father built the boom and recovery system in 48 through 50. Been running ever since. Tom walked around the autocar, slowly studying it. Ed let him look. Better to let people see what they were dealing with than try to convince them with words. It's a custom build, Tom asked, looking at the boom welds. Every bit of it. My father bought a bare chassis from Autocar Company. Built everything else by hand. Boom winch system, frame reinforcements. Took him 2 years working nights and weekends. Why? Ed looked at Tom. Because working men needed help and couldn't afford what recovery companies charged. My father was a steel worker. Saw too many guys lose trucks or equipment because they couldn't pay for recovery. Figured he could build something to help. Tom nodded slowly. Then he looked at Ed, really looked, taking in the 73 years, the work-worn hands, the way Ed moved like a man whose body remembered decades of hard labor. No disrespect, Ed, but that boom looks homemade, and you look like you should be retired on a beach somewhere. How's any of this supposed to pull an 80-ton crane out of the river when Hartman's got a 200-ton hydraulic system that can't do it? Because Hartman's trying to solve the wrong problem, Ed said. They're trying to power through, trying to muscle the crane out with lifting capacity. But that's not the problem. The problem is ground stability and pull angle. My truck's lighter, spreads its load better. That boom, Ed pointed up at the 24-foot tower, means I can work from back where the ground's solid and still get a steep enough angle to break the suction in the mud. And if it doesn't work, then you're no worse off than you are now. Tom studied Ed's face for a long moment. Then he glanced toward the river, toward the crane that had been sitting there for 4 days, toward the insurance adjuster who would be arriving in a few hours to declare everything a total loss. All right, Tom said. Mind if I take a look at the situation first? That's what I'm here to do. Crane's over there. Tom gestured toward the river. But be careful near the bank. Ground's unstable. We've had a couple spots where people stepped and the earth just gave way. Ed nodded, picked up his tool belt from the autocar's cab and buckled it on. Felt the familiar weight settle around his waist. Then he started walking toward the water. Behind him, he heard someone say, "Is that old guy serious?" Someone else laughed. Looks like Tom's desperate enough to try anything. Ed ignored them. He'd heard worse over the years. Had heard people doubt Staphen's design dozens of times, had proven them wrong dozens of times. Would do it again today if his body could hold up. The riverbank was exactly what Ed expected. The ground near the water was soft, soaked by seepage, unstable in the way that earth got when water moved through it constantly. Further back, maybe 80 feet from the water's edge, the ground rose slightly and the soil changed. You could see it in the color and the texture. Darker near the water where moisture stayed, lighter and firmer further back where drainage was better. Ed walked along the bank, not going too close, studying the soil. Every so often, he'd kneel, his knees protesting, and push his fingers into the earth, testing density, testing moisture, testing how the ground would respond to weight. 42 years working around Pittsburgh's rivers and mills had taught Ed to read earth like other men read books. Soil had a language. Told you stories about what was underneath, about how it would behave under load, about where you could trust it and where it would betray you. This soil told Ed that the topsoil was thin, maybe 3 feet, sitting on bedrock. The seepage came from the river, moving through gaps in the bedrock, rising up through the topsoil. The ground near the water was a sponge, wouldn't hold concentrated loads. Further back where the rise started, the bedrock was closer to the surface and the drainage better. That ground would hold. Ed took a steel rod from his tool belt and started driving it into the earth at different spots, feeling how deep it went before hitting resistance. mapping the subsurface in his mind, building a picture of where solid ground was and where it wasn't. Behind him, Ed could hear the Hartman crew talking. Couldn't make out words, but heard the tone. Skepticism, amusement. The kind of talk that happened when professionals watched an amateur try to do their job. Ed didn't care. Let them talk. Results were what mattered. He walked to where the crane sat in the water, studying it from the bank. The counterweight was above the surface, angled upstream. The boom was invisible, buried in river mud pointing downstream. The current pushed against the submerged equipment, steadily trying to roll it deeper. 80 tons, Tom had said. That matched what Ed was seeing. Big crawler crane. Probably a link belt or similar. Good equipment. Expensive equipment. The kind that could make or break a small construction company. The crane sat in maybe 12 feet of water, not deep by river standards, but deep enough that the mud bottom was soft and thick. The boom had punched through the surface layer and into the river bottom, and now the mud had closed around it like a fist. Suction was the enemy here. Not weight, not current. Suction. The mud gripping the boom, fighting any attempt to pull straight up. Try to lift and the suction would just pull harder. The harder you pulled, the harder the mud pulled back. Stefan had taught Ed about suction when Ed was 19, pulling a truck out of a quarry pond. Don't fight straight against resistance, Eddie. Find angle that breaks resistance. Shift weight. Change direction. Make the load move with you instead of against you. Ed studied the angle of the crane, the direction of the current, the position of the counterweight. Built a picture in his mind of how the forces were working. The current pushed the boom downstream. The weight pulled the whole assembly toward the bottom. The counterweight was the only thing keeping the crane from rolling over completely. To pull this out, Ed would need to do three things. First, break the suction. Not with brute force, but with angle and steady pressure. Pull upward and forward simultaneously, not trying to lift the crane, but trying to shift it. Trying to roll it slightly, change its position, let water flow into the gap where mud was gripping. Second, use the current instead of fighting it. The current wanted to push the boom downstream. Let it. Use that force. Pull from an angle that let the current help instead of hinder. Third, be patient. This wasn't a job you could rush. Rush and the cable broke, or the truck tipped, or something went wrong. Slow and steady. Let physics work. Let time work. Ed could do this. The Autocar could do this. But first he needed to rig it right. Ed walked back from the river's edge, studying the ground, looking for the spot where he'd positioned the Autocar. Found it 80 feet back from the water on the slight rise where the soil was firmer and drier. Drove his steel rod into the earth. Hit resistance at 4 feet, bedrock, solid. This was the spot. Ed looked at the concrete Jersey barriers lining the access road. Heavy barriers, 1,200 pounds each, placed to mark the boundary between the road and the work area. Perfect for anchor points. The geometry was coming together in Ed's mind. Autocar here. Cable to the first barrier through a snatch block to create mechanical advantage. Second cable to another barrier. Third block on the truck itself. Run the working cable through the blocks to multiply force. Position everything so the final pull came from an angle that would break suction and let the current help. 24 feet of boom height meant the cable would run at a steep angle even from 80 feet back. Steep angle meant less horizontal force, more vertical lift. That was what you wanted when pulling from mud. Straight horizontal pull just dragged the crane through mud, fighting all the way. Angled pull lifted and shifted simultaneously, breaking the grip. Ed walked back toward Tom, who was standing with his foreman and 3 other men, all of them watching Ed with expressions that ranged from curious to openly skeptical. "I can pull it," Ed said. One of the men, younger, maybe 40, wearing a Hartman recovery jacket, laughed. "Sir, no offense, but we've been trying to pull that crane for 4 days with equipment that makes your truck look like a toy. If we can't do it, I don't see how you can." "What's your name?" Ed asked. "Derek Hammond. I'm the senior engineer with Hartman, and I'm telling you the physics don't work. That crane weighs 80 tons. Your truck weighs maybe 10, maybe 12 tons at most. Even with perfect mechanical advantage, you're trying to pull 8 times your own weight across soft ground and through river mud. The math says no." "Math's not the problem," Ed said. "Approach is. You're trying to deadlift 80 tons, trying to power through, But power's not the answer here. Position is, angle is. Understanding how the weight's distributed and how the mud's holding and where the forces are working. That's what engineering is. Derek said, his tone patient but dismissive. That's what we do. We calculate load forces, we model the stresses, we design recovery systems based on proven principles. What you're describing is guesswork. It's not guesswork if you've done it 50 times. When, Derek challenged, when did you last do this kind of work? 1991, Ed admitted. 7 years ago, cement truck through ice on a quarry pond. 7 years, Derek repeated. He looked at Tom. Tom, with all respect, this man hasn't done recovery work in 7 years. His equipment is 50 years old, and he's suggesting an approach that violates basic engineering principles. I can't recommend that you let him try. Tom looked at Ed, then at Derek, then at the crane in the river. What have we got to lose? The crane could sink deeper. The mud could shift. We could end up with a total loss that's unsalvageable instead of just difficult. The insurance company's coming at 2 to declare it a total loss anyway, Tom said. So if Ed makes it worse, we're no worse off than we're going to be in 4 hours. Derek shook his head but said nothing. Tom looked at Ed. What do you need? Time to rig properly. 2 hours, maybe 3. Access to those concrete barriers for anchor points. And for everyone to stay back while I work. Can't have people standing around close. If something breaks loose, I need clear space. You got it. Tom turned to his crew. Everyone here that give Ed room to work. Nobody goes near the recovery area unless he asks for help. The crew nodded, though Ed could see doubt on most of their faces. They thought he was wasting time. Thought he was a crazy old man who didn't know when to quit. They'd know differently in a few hours. Ed walked back to the autocar and began pulling equipment from the toolbox mounted behind the cab. Cable, snatch blocks, shackles, chain. Everything carefully maintained, oiled, inspected. Stephen's tools, Ed's tools, tools that had been working for 50 years because they were built right and cared for properly. He laid everything out on the ground in order, organized, ready, the way Stephen had taught him to prepare for any job. Never rush the setup. Set up wrong and everything else goes wrong. Set up right and the job takes care of itself. Ed looked at the equipment spread on the ground, looked at the autocar with its hand-welded boom, looked at the river and the crane waiting in cold water. Time to prove that Stephen's engineering still worked. Time to prove that old iron and old knowledge could still solve problems the modern world couldn't figure out. Ed picked up the first cable and started walking toward the Jersey barriers. Behind him, Derek Hammond said to Tom, "This is a mistake." Tom didn't answer. Ed worked for 2 hours rigging the pole, and the entire construction crew watched like they were witnessing either a miracle or a disaster in slow motion. He started with the autocar, positioning it exactly where he'd chosen earlier, 80 feet back from the river's edge, on the slight rise where the ground was firm. Ed drove the truck forward and back several times, feeling how the earth responded to its weight. The ground settled slightly, but held. The tires didn't sink. The frame stayed level. Good. Ed engaged the parking brake, shut down the engine, and climbed out. Checked the ground around each tire. Still solid. The autocar weighed 20,000 pounds, and that weight was distributed across 8 tires, each one wide and industrial. 2,500 pounds per tire. Not enough point pressure to sink into this ground. Modern recovery cranes used outriggers, massive hydraulic pads that extended from the chassis to create a stable platform. Those pads concentrated enormous weight onto 4 small points. In soft ground, those points sank. The autocar didn't have outriggers, didn't need them. The truck itself was the platform, and its weight spread across enough area that even soft ground could hold it. That was part of Stephen's design. No outriggers to sink, no complicated stabilization system, just a heavy truck on good tires relying on basic physics instead of hydraulic complexity. Ed walked to the first Jersey barrier, the one position closest to his pull line. The barrier was massive concrete and steel, 1,200 pounds of dead weight sitting on the ground. Ed pulled a heavy-duty snatch block from his tool belt, a pulley system and a steel frame designed to redirect cable while maintaining tension. The block was decades old, but well-maintained. The sheave turned smoothly when Ed spun it with his hand. The frame showed no cracks. He secured the snatch block to the barrier using a chain and shackle wrapping the chain around the barrier's base, threading it through the block's anchor point, closing it with the shackle. Pulled hard on the chain to test the connection. The barrier didn't move. The chain didn't slip. The shackle held. Good. Ed walked to the second barrier 30 feet further along the access road and repeated the process. Another snatch block, another chain, another shackle. Everything checked twice. The geometry was important. The two barriers formed anchor points that would redirect his cable, creating mechanical advantage. One cable from the Autocar's winch would run through these blocks, doubling back on itself, so that pulling 1 foot of cable actually moved the load 2 feet. With 3 blocks total, including one fixed to the Autocar's frame, Ed would have 3-to-1 mechanical advantage. That meant the Autocar's 10-ton winch capacity effectively became 30 tons of pulling force. Not enough to lift the crane directly, but enough to shift it, to break suction, to coax it into moving. Ed walked back to the Autocar and opened the winch housing. The drum sat horizontally behind the cab, driven by a power takeoff from the transmission. Stefan's design used mechanical gears, not hydraulics. Turn the transmission engagement and engine power transferred through a series of reduction gears to the winch drum. Slow speed, enormous torque. The drum held 200 feet of cable half-inch steel wire rope wound tight and neat. Ed pulled the free end and began walking it toward his anchor points. The cable was heavy, maybe a pound, per foot stiff from age and oil, but still flexible enough to work properly. Ed checked it as he walked, running it through his hands, feeling for broken strands or weak spots. Found none. The cable was good. Ed threaded the cable through the first snatch block, redirecting it 90 degrees. Then through the second block, redirecting it again. The cable now ran from the Autocar through 2 anchored blocks and back toward the truck, where Ed secured it to a third block mounted on the Autocar's frame itself. Now the working end of the cable ran free, pointing toward the river, ready to connect to the crane. Ed looked at the geometry. The cable ran 80 feet from the Autocar to the water's edge, but because of the blocks and redirections pulling, that cable would create forces multiplied by 3. The Autocar would pull 1 foot and the crane would move 3 feet. That was the theory. In practice, there would be friction losses in the block stretch, in the cable slip, in the connections. The 3-to-1 advantage would really be maybe 2.5 to 1, still better than pulling direct. And the angle was right. From 80 feet back and 24 feet high, the cable would approach the crane at roughly a 17-degree angle from horizontal. Steep enough to provide lift, shallow enough to provide forward pull. The perfect combination to break suction and shift weight. Tom Del Vecchio had been watching from a distance. Now he walked over. "That's a lot of cable," Tom said. "Need it for mechanical advantage. Every time the cable changes direction through a block, I double the force. 3 blocks means 3 times the pulling power. Will that be enough? For pulling straight, no. For shifting the weight and breaking suctions, should be." "Should be," Tom repeated. "Nothing's certain until you try it," Ed said. "But the math works. The geometry works. If the ground holds and the cable holds and I can get proper hookup on the crane, it'll work." "What about you?" Tom asked. "That water is 34 degrees. You're going to wade in there and hook up the cable yourself." Ed looked at the river, at the water moving cold and steady past the submerged crane. "Have to. Can't rig it from here. Someone needs to go in and find the right attachment point on the crane. Has to be the right point or the pull won't work properly." "Ed, you're 73 years old. That water could kill you." "Could kill anyone," Ed agreed. "But I know what I'm looking for. Know where to attach. Someone else goes in, they might hook it wrong, might not understand the angles. Rather do it myself and know it's right." Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but what could he say? Ed was right. You couldn't rig a recovery from a distance. Someone had to get wet. "How long will you be in the water?" Tom asked. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Long enough to swim out, find the hook point, secure the shackle, swim back. "You're not swimming," Tom said firmly. "We've got chest waders. You'll wade in with a safety line. My crew will be on the bank holding the line. If you go under or start having trouble, they pull you out immediately." Ed nodded. That was reasonable. "All right. And if you start feeling too cold, you come out. No arguing. I'm not watching someone die of hypothermia on my job site. Fair enough. Tom walked back to his crew and returned 5 minutes later with a pair of chest waders industrial rubber designed for exactly this kind of work. He also brought a safety harness and 100 feet of yellow rescue rope. "Put these on," Tom said. "My guys will help with the harness." Ed stripped off his coat and tool belt and pulled the waders on over his work pants and boots. They were too big, probably designed for someone taller and heavier than Ed's 5'9" frame. But they'd work. Ed cinched them tight at the waist. Two of Tom's crew helped him into the safety harness, a network of straps that went around his chest and under his arms. They clipped the rescue rope to the harness and tied the other end to one of the concrete barriers. "We'll have 3 men on the rope," Tom said. "You go under. We'll have you out in seconds." Ed nodded, picked up his tool belt, found the shackle he'd need for the hookup, clipped it to the harness within easy reach. Then he lifted the free end of the cable, coiled it over his shoulder, and started walking toward the water. Behind him, Ed heard someone say, "He's really going in." Someone else said, "Jesus, he's crazy." Maybe, but crazy was what the job required sometimes. Ed reached the water's edge and paused. The river moved past, gray and cold, carrying pieces of ice no bigger than dinner plates. The water looked thick, heavy, the way very cold water looked. Moved with power, even though the surface appeared calm. Ed had been in this river before, knew what to expect, knew the cold would hit like a hammer, knew it would try to take his breath and his strength and his ability to think clearly. But he'd been through worse. 1963, falling through ice, being pulled from water so cold it had felt like knives. If he'd survived that, he could survive 5 minutes wading in chest-deep water. Ed stepped into the Allegheny River. The cold hit him instantly. Even through the rubber waders, even though the water wasn't directly touching his skin, the cold radiated through. His legs felt it first, then his waist as he waded deeper. The current pushed against him, trying to sweep him downstream. The river bottom was mud and rock, uneven, treacherous. Ed moved slowly, felt each step before committing his weight. The cable over his shoulder was heavy, pulling him off balance. The water was at his chest now, cold like he was wading through ice. His breath came short and sharp. Behind him on the bank, he could hear Tom's crew watching, could hear them talking in low voices. Couldn't make out the words over the sound of water moving past his head. 20 feet from shore. The crane was 30 feet from shore. Ed kept waiting. The water reached his neck. Any deeper, and it would come over the top of the waders, fill them, pull him down. Ed stopped, found solid footing, and looked at the submerged crane. The counterweight rose above the water, maybe 6 feet away. The crane's main body was submerged, the boom completely underwater, buried in mud. Ed could see the frame, could see where the boom attached to the rotating bed, could see where the current pushed against the metal and created small eddies and swirls. Ed took a deep breath and duck-walked deeper, keeping his head above water but getting his body close to the crane. The cold was making his hands numb, making his fingers slow. He fumbled the shackle from his harness, fumbled the cable off his shoulder, found the attachment point he needed. The crane's frame had multiple connection points for rigging and transportation. Ed needed one that would pull the crane upward and forward simultaneously. Not straight up, that would just fight the suction. Not straight forward, that would just drag it through mud. Upward and forward together, angled, shifting the weight onto its pivot point. Ed found the spot, a structural member on the frame, solid steel, designed to take load. He threaded the cable through. His hands were so cold now that he could barely feel what he was doing. Moving on memory and experience, fingers doing work they'd done 1,000 times, even though he couldn't feel them doing it. Got the cable through, got the shackle positioned, started threading the pin. His fingers slipped. The pin dropped. Ed watched it fall toward the water, grabbed for it, caught it somehow, even though his hands felt like blocks of wood. Tried again. Got the pin started. Threaded it home. Tightened it as much as his numb hands could manage. Pulled on the connection. Hard as he could. The shackle held. The cable held. Good enough. Ed turned and started wading back toward shore. The current pushed from behind, now helping. But his legs were weak from the cold. His whole body was shaking. The bank looked very far away, even though it was only 30 feet. Ed kept moving. One step, another step. His feet found rocks, found mud, found bottom. 20 feet from shore, 15 feet, his legs gave out. Ed went down cold water, closing over his head for a second before the safety line went taut, and Tom's crew hauled him upright. He surfaced gasping, and they pulled him toward shore, 3 men on the rope, dragging him through water and onto dry ground. Ed lay on the frozen earth, shaking so hard his teeth chattered, and distantly heard Tom shouting for blankets and hot coffee. Someone wrapped him in blankets. Someone else pressed a cup of hot liquid into his hands. Ed tried to drink, but his hands shook so badly he spilled half of it. "You got hypothermia?" Tom asked, his face close to Ed's, worried. Ed shook his head. Just cold. We need to get you to a hospital." No, just need to warm up." "Ed, I'm fine." Ed forced himself to sit up, forced his voice steady. "Did I get the hookup?" Tom stared at him. "You nearly drowned, and you're asking about the hookup. Did I get it?" Tom looked at the cable running into the water. Looked at Ed. "Yeah, you got it. Cable's attached." Good." Ed pulled the blankets tighter around himself. "Then let's pull this crane." "Not until you warm up. You can barely talk." "I can operate the winch. Just need my hands working." Ed held up his hands. They were white, bloodless, shaking. But as he sat there, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot coffee, feeling returned slowly. Painful feeling, like needles in his fingers and toes. But feeling. After 20 minutes, Ed could hold the coffee cup without spilling. After 30 minutes, he could stand without help. After 40 minutes, his speech was clear and his hands steady enough to work. "I'm ready," Ed said. Tom looked at him like he was crazy, which was fair. Ed felt crazy, felt like he should be at home in a warm bed instead of standing on a frozen riverbank preparing to operate 50-year-old equipment. But the cable was rigged. The hookup was made. The geometry was right. Time to pull. Ed walked to the autocar, still wrapped in one blanket over his shoulders, climbed into the cab, started the engine. It caught immediately, rumbled to life, settled into its familiar rhythm. Ed engaged the power takeoff for the winch, heard the gears mesh, felt the vibration change as power transferred from the engine to the winch drum, put his hand on the winch control lever. Tom appeared at the driver's window. "You sure about this?" "No," Ed said honestly, "but it's worth trying." Tom nodded, stepped back, raised his hand to his crew. "Everyone clear the recovery area. Give the truck room." The crew moved back. Even Derek Hammond, who'd been standing with his arms crossed, backed up to safe distance. Ed looked at the cable running from the autocar through the snatch blocks toward the water. Looked at the crane's counterweight visible above the surface. Thought about Stefan building this truck, building this boom, designing this system 70 years ago because he believed in helping people who needed help. "All right, Pa," Ed said quietly. "Let's see if it still works." He pulled the winch control lever. The drum began to turn. The sound was deep and mechanical, the kind of sound that came from gears as big as dinner plates, meshing with other gears, transferring power through solid steel instead of hydraulic fluid. Slow, steady, relentless. The cable went taut. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened. The cable stretched slightly, taking up slack, distributing tension through the system. The snatch blocks creaked as the cable pulled against them. The autocar's frame groaned as forces transferred through its structure. Then the crane moved, not much, just a tiny shift, the slightest tilting of the counterweight, but it moved. Ed held steady pressure on the winch control. Didn't try to force it, didn't try to rush, just maintained constant tension, letting the forces work, letting physics do what mathematics said it should do. The cable stretched tighter. The autocar's boom swayed slightly under load. Ed felt the truck settle deeper into the ground as its tires compressed, but they didn't sink. The ground held. The crane shifted again, more this time. The counterweight tilted noticeably as the boom underneath began to break free from the mud's grip. Ed heard the sound from the river, a deep, wet, sucking sound. The sound of mud releasing its hold. The sound of 80 tons of steel beginning to move after 4 days of being stuck. "Holy shit," someone said from the crew. "It's moving." Ed kept the winch turning. Slow, steady. The cable moved at walking pace, maybe 2 feet per minute, but it moved continuously. Never stopped, never jerked. Just steady pressure, breaking suction, shifting weight, coaxing the crane to move with the pull instead of fighting it. 5 minutes later, the boom broke completely free from the mud. The sound was like a massive cork being pulled from a bottle. The crane lurched forward in the water. The counterweight rose higher as the whole assembly pivoted on its underwater tracks. 10 minutes later, the crane was moving steadily through the water toward shore, being pulled by a wrecker that weighed 1/8 as much. 15 minutes later, the crane reached shallow water. Its tracks found bottom. It began to crawl up the bank under its own weight, guided by the cable pulled by the autocar's steady winch. 20 minutes later, the crane sat on dry land, dripping river water, covered in mud, but out. Ed shut down the winch, set the brake, cut the engine, climbed out of the autocar. His whole body hurt. His back screamed. His legs were weak from the cold and the stress. His hands barely worked. But the crane was out. Tom Delvecchio stood staring at the crane, then at the autocar, then at Ed. "You did it," Tom said quietly. "Jesus Christ, you actually did it." Ed nodded, too tired to speak. He walked to the cable and began disconnecting the shackle from the crane. His hands shook, but he managed it. Began coiling the cable, working slowly, methodically, the way Stefan had taught him. Never leave equipment rigged after a due. Always put it away properly. Cable gets kinked, it weakens. Gets weak, it breaks when you need it. Tom walked over. "Ed, stop. Let my crew handle that." "My cable," Ed said. "My responsibility." "Ed, you're shaking. You just pulled a crane out of a river and you're barely standing. Please, let my guys help." Ed looked at Tom, saw genuine concern there, saw respect. "All right," Ed said finally. Tom called over 2 of his crew members. "Help him coil this cable. He'll tell you how. Do exactly what he says." The 2 men came over, young guys, maybe 30. They looked at Ed with something like awe. "Show us how," one of them said. Ed showed them how to coil without kinking, how to check for damage as you coiled, how to store it so it would be ready next time. When the cable was coiled and secured in the autocar's toolbox, when the shackles and blocks were stowed, when everything was put away properly, Ed stood next to the truck and finally let himself feel how exhausted he was. 73 years old. Just pulled 80 tons of crane out of a river. His body was done. Tom appeared next to him with a thermos. "Coffee, hot, drink it." Ed took the thermos in hands that could barely grip and drank. The coffee was hot enough to burn. It felt like salvation. "How much do I owe you?" Tom asked. "Nothing." "Ed, you just saved us $500,000. Maybe saved my company. I have to pay you something." "You don't owe me anything. Your crane's out. That's enough." "Why would you do this for free?" Ed looked at the autocar, at the boom Stefan had welded by hand, at the truck that had been built to help people, at the work that had made Ed feel useful again for the first time in 7 years. "My father built this truck to help people," Ed said. "Steel workers mostly. Men who couldn't afford the fancy recovery companies. He never charged much. Sometimes didn't charge at all. He said helping people was what the truck was for." Ed looked at Tom. "That's still what it's for." Tom pulled out his wallet, took out every bill in it, maybe $300. "At least take this. Gas money. Your time. Sausage coin." Ed shook his head. "Keep it. Buy your crew lunch. They've had a rough week." Tom stood there holding the money, looking like he didn't know what to say. "I won't forget this," Tom finally managed. Ed nodded, climbed back into the autocar. His body protested every movement. The engine cough caught, settled into its rumbling idle. Ed put it in gear and began driving away from the construction site. Drove at 25 miles per hour, the boom swaying slightly, while Tom's crew stood and watched him go. In the autocar's side mirror, Ed could see them. Could see Derek Hammond standing next to the Hartman recovery equipment, staring. Could see Tom with his crew talking animatedly. Could see the crane sitting on dry land, mud dripping from its frame. Ed drove home slowly, following a Route 28 south along the river, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt like he'd done something that mattered. Felt like Stefan would have been proud. Felt like maybe being 73 years old didn't mean being useless after all. The autocar rumbled through Pittsburgh streets, and Ed Kokalchik drove it home to the garage where his father had built it 50 years ago, where it would wait until the next time someone needed help. because that's what it was for. Ed drove home with his body aching and his hands still numb from the cold water, and the feeling that he'd just stepped back into a life he thought was over. The autocar's heater worked, barely pushing warm air into the cab that did little against the bone-deep chill from 20 minutes in the Allegheny River. But Ed barely noticed the cold anymore. His mind was replaying the pull, the moment when the cable went taut and the crane shifted, the sound of mud releasing its grip. Replaying the look on Tom Delvecchio's face when 80 tons of steel had crawled out of the water, pulled by equipment everyone thought was too old to matter. The drive back took 40 minutes at the autocar's maximum comfortable speed of 30 miles per hour. Ed stayed in the right lane, let faster traffic pass, ignored the stares and the occasional horn from drivers who couldn't understand why anyone would drive something so slow on a modern road. When Ed finally turned onto a street in Lawrenceville, when he pulled into his driveway and backed the autocar into his garage, when he shut down the engine and sat in the sudden silence listening to metal tick and cool, he realized he was exhausted in a way he hadn't been exhausted in years. The exhaustion of doing real work, of using your body and your mind and your skills for something that mattered. The kind of exhaustion that hurt, but felt good. The kind that meant you'd accomplished something. Ed climbed out of the cab slowly. Every joint protested. His back felt like someone had driven nails into his spine. His legs were weak. His hands barely worked. But he'd pulled a crane out of the Allegheny River. At 73 years old with 50-year-old equipment, Ed had done what modern machinery couldn't do. He walked into his house, stripped off his damp clothes, and stood in a shower hot enough to hurt, letting the water work the cold out of his bones. Stood there for 20 minutes until his fingers and toes felt normal again, until the shaking stopped, until his body remembered it was supposed to be warm. After the shower, Ed made himself eggs and toast, simple food that his hands could manage. Ate standing at the kitchen counter, too tired to sit at the table properly. Drank 3 cups of coffee, felt human again. The phone rang. Ed almost didn't answer, but habit made him pick it up. "Hello, Mr. Kokalchik. This is Margaret Hartman from Hartman Recovery." Ed set down his coffee cup. "Ma'am, I'm calling because I wanted to apologize." Her voice was controlled, professional, but Ed heard something underneath it. Not quite anger, more like frustrated respect. "Derek Hammond shouldn't have spoken to you the way he did at the Delvecchio site. He was out of line. He was protecting his reputation," Ed said. "Can't fault a man for that. Still, he was rude." And more importantly, a pause, then the words came out like they'd been forced. "You did something my crew couldn't do, with equipment that by any reasonable measure shouldn't have worked. Tom Delvecchio's been calling everyone in Pittsburgh to tell them about the old guy with the old truck who saved his project." Words getting around fast. Ed didn't know what to say to that. "I'd like to understand how you did it," Margaret continued. "Would you be willing to have coffee and explain your approach, professional curiosity?" Ed thought about that, thought about sitting in his kitchen alone, watching the news, feeling useful for one day and then going back to being useless. Thought about the autocar sitting in the garage waiting. "All right," Ed said. "When?" They met 2 days later at a diner in Lawrenceville. Ed chose a booth near the back, habit from decades of meeting people to discuss work. Margaret Hartman arrived exactly on time, and Ed saw immediately that she wasn't what he expected. 62 years old, Ed guessed. Tall, maybe 5'10", with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Work boots and canvas pants, and a heavy jacket that had seen real use. Calloused hands when she shook Ed's. Working hands. She ordered coffee black and got straight to business. "I inherited Hartman Recovery from my husband 5 years ago," Margaret said, her voice matter of fact. "William built it from nothing starting in '79. By the time he died in '93 heart attack, at 58 we had 12 employees and equipment worth $3 million. She paused, drank her coffee, continued. "I've been fighting for 5 years to prove I can run this company as well as William did. Construction is a man's world, especially recovery. I've had contractors refuse to work with us because they don't trust a woman to handle equipment. Had engineers question my decisions. Had my own crew doubt whether I knew what I was doing." Margaret looked at Ed directly. "I've spent 5 years proving myself, earning respect, building a reputation. And then you show up at the Delvecchio site with a truck older than my oldest employee, and do a job my 200-ton crane couldn't touch. I need to know how that happened. Ed sipped his coffee. Your crane's built for power. Mine's built for leverage. Explain. So Ed did. Talked for 30 minutes about boom height and anchor points and mechanical advantage through snatch blocks. About the physics of shifting weight instead of lifting it. About reading ground conditions and understanding how river mud created suction and how breaking that suction was more important than brute force pulling. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding her eyes sharp and focused. When Ed finished, she sat back. You learned all that in the steel mills. Learned it from my father, Ed said. He spent 40 years pulling equipment out of bad situations. He used to say the difference between good recovery work and bad recovery work is whether you're fighting the problem or working with it. Your father built your truck, 1948 through 1950. Took him 2 years working nights and weekends. Built the boom by hand from scrap steel he got at the mill. Why build a wrecker instead of just using commercial recovery services? Because working men needed help and couldn't afford what commercial services charged. Ed looked at Margaret. No offense. None taken. She smiled slightly, the first smile Ed had seen from her. My husband used to say the same thing. Said he got into recovery work because someone had to help the little guys. Then the business grew, and suddenly we were charging what the little guys couldn't afford. It bothered him, bothered me too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Ed with an expression that was part calculation, part hope. Would you be willing to consult for us on jobs where unconventional approaches might work? We get calls sometimes for situations where standard equipment won't work. Your experience might make the difference between a successful recovery and abandoning equipment. I'm not looking for work, Ed said. I'm not offering employment. I'm offering collaboration. When we get a call that seems impossible, I'd like to be able to call you, ask your opinion. Maybe have you come look at the site. If you think your truck could handle it, you do the job. If not, we at least got a second perspective. Ed studied her face, saw determination there, saw someone fighting to prove herself in a world that wanted her to fail. Saw something of Stefan in her, that stubborn refusal to quit, just because things were hard. What would you pay? Ed asked. Whatever's fair. Market rate for consultation. If you do a recovery, we split the fee, 60-40, you getting the 60 since it's your equipment and expertise. I don't need money, Ed said. Got my pension from the mill, house paid off, Mary's life insurance sitting in the bank untouched. Then why did you help Tom Delvecchio? Because he needed help. Margaret looked at Ed for a long moment. You're serious. You pulled that crane for free. That's what the truck's for. Most people don't think that way anymore. Most people aren't my father's son. Margaret smiled again, wider this time. Your father raised you right, Mr. Kokalchik. Ed. Margaret, she pulled a business card from her pocket, wrote a number on the back. That's my direct line, not the office number. If you hear about a wait or if you just want to talk shop, call me. Ed took the card, looked at her handwriting, clear and precise despite the cheap pen. Can I ask you something? Margaret said. Why do you do this? Really, you're 73 years old. You could be retired, relaxing, enjoying your golden years. Instead, you're wading into freezing rivers and pulling equipment. Why? Ed thought about that. Thought about the 7 years after Mary died when he'd sat in his house feeling useless. Thought about how it felt standing on Tom's job site knowing he could help, knowing the Autocar could help. Because I can, Ed said finally. And when a man can do something that helps someone, when he has the skills and the tools and the knowledge, and he just sits idle, he's wasting what he's been given. My father taught me that. Your father sounds like he was remarkable. He was. Built this truck with his hands because he believed in helping people. Used it for 40 years to pull working men out of bad situations. Never charged much, sometimes charged nothing. He said if you had the ability to help, you had the responsibility to help. Margaret nodded slowly. William used to say something similar. Said the equipment didn't matter as much as what you did with it. Said a man with a tow truck and a good heart could do more for his community than a company with $1 million in equipment and no sense of service. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood that work wasn't just about money, that helping people mattered, that equipment was just tools, and what mattered was what you used them for. Call me, Margaret said finally. When you're ready? If you're ready. I think we could do good work together. Ed nodded, watched her leave, sat in the diner booth drinking his coffee, thinking about what she'd said. Collaboration. Working together. Using the autocar for more than just one job. It felt like possibility. Like maybe the 7 years of sitting idle were over. Like maybe Ed had more work ahead of him. Like maybe 73 wasn't the end after all. Ed finished his coffee and drove home, backed the autocar into its garage. But this time, instead of closing the doors and walking away, Ed spent an hour going over the truck, checking every system, lubricating cables, inspecting welds, making sure everything was ready. Ready for what he wasn't sure, but ready. The call from Tom Delvecchio came 4 days after the crane recovery. Ed, it's Tom Delvecchio. Tom, how's the bridge? Back on schedule thanks to you. Tom's voice was warm, grateful, but Ed heard something else underneath it. Uncertainty. Listen, I'm calling because word got around about what you did, about the crane, and I got a call this morning from a guy up in Butler County who's got a problem. Bulldozer stuck in a strip mine. Ground's unstable because of old mine shafts underneath. 3 recovery companies already told him no, said it's too dangerous. Ed felt something stir in his chest. The same feeling he'd had hearing about Tom's crane. The feeling of being needed. What kind of unstable? The kind where you walk on it and it feels like a trampoline. Old coal mine shafts below the surface, some of them collapsed, creating voids. The bulldozer's sitting on ground that might give way any minute. They're worried it'll go down a shaft and maybe trigger a bigger collapse. They try pulling it yet. Nobody will touch it. Hartman said no. 2 other companies said no. The mining company's ready to write it off and just abandon the equipment. But it's a brand new Cat D9, $400,000. They'd rather save it if they can. Ed looked out his kitchen window at the garage, at the autocar waiting inside. Thought about unstable ground and old mine shafts and a heavy piece of equipment that needed moving from a distance. The kind of job the autocar was built for. Give me the number, Ed said. The strip mine job took Ed 6 hours on a cold February morning, with wind coming hard across open ground and making his eyes water. The bulldozer sat 200 yards from the access road on ground that looked solid but wasn't. Ed could see it from where he parked the autocar, a big yellow machine, sitting alone on earth that rippled slightly when the wind blew hard. The mining company supervisor was a woman named Patricia Ross, maybe 50, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. She met Ed at the site entrance with visible nervousness. You the guy Tom Delvecchio sent? Ed Kokalchik. That's my truck. Patricia looked at the autocar, looked at Ed. Her expression said she was thinking the same thing. Everyone thought this old man with this old truck was supposed to do what 3 modern recovery companies refused to attempt. How much do you know about undermined ground? Patricia asked. Enough. Worked mill cleanup sites in the 70s and 80s. Some of them had underground voids from old mining operations. Learn to read the signs. The signs here say that ground could give way without warning. We've had 2 minor collapses in the past month. Nothing big, just surface settling. But each collapse creates more instability. That bulldozer weighs 30 tons. If it goes down, it could trigger a collapse that takes out a third of this section. Ed studied the ground between the access road and the bulldozer. The earth showed stress patterns, subtle ripples, and cracks that indicated settling. The surface looked solid, but it was deceptive. Underneath, old mine shafts created voids, and the earth above those voids was essentially a thin bridge waiting to collapse. You couldn't drive recovery equipment across that ground. The weight would trigger exactly the collapse they were trying to avoid. And you couldn't work close to the bulldozer because the ground around it was the most unstable. But the autocar didn't need to get close. Ed positioned the truck 200 feet back from the bulldozer on ground that was solid bedrock exposed where decades of mining had stripped away the topsoil. He spent 2 hours rigging an elaborate cable system using intermediate anchor points. Rocks he'd had Patricia's crew drag into position, heavy boulders that distributed weight across wider areas instead of concentrating it. The cable ran from the autocar through a series of snatch blocks, each block multiplying mechanical advantage, each one positioned carefully to avoid putting pressure on unstable ground. The final cable reached the bulldozer through a system Ed had rigged that let him control the pull angle without ever stepping onto questionable earth. Patricia watched from beside the autocar, her radio in hand, her face tight with worry. "If this triggers a collapse," she started. "Then we lose the bulldozer," Ed finished. "But we won't lose anyone. Everyone's clear of the area. If the ground goes, it goes. Equipment can be replaced. People can't. That's a $400,000 machine. It's also 30 tons sitting on ground that wants to fail. Sometimes you lose equipment. Rather lose equipment than make the situation worse by rushing." Ed started the pull at 10 in the morning. Worked slowly, patiently, pulling 6 inches at a time, then stopping to let the ground settle to see if the stress would trigger a collapse. Each pull sent vibrations through the earth. Each pull risked being the one that broke the fragile bridge holding the bulldozer up. But each pull also moved the bulldozer 6 inches closer to safety. By noon, the bulldozer had moved 30 feet. By 2 in the afternoon, 60 feet. By 4 in the afternoon, as February daylight started to fade, the bulldozer reached ground solid enough that its own tracks could get traction. Ed disconnected the cable and watched the bulldozer drive itself the rest of the way to safety under its own power. Patricia tried to pay him $2,000. Ed took $300 for fuel and wear on equipment and left. "Why?" Patricia asked, genuinely confused. "You just saved us $400,000 in 6 months of environmental cleanup if that thing had gone down a shaft. You should charge real money for this." "Don't need money," Ed said. "Need to know I helped. That's payment enough." He drove home as sunset turned Pittsburgh's sky orange and pink, and when he pulled into his driveway, he realized he felt more alive than he had in 8 years. The cement truck through the ice happened in late February. The quarry pond had looked frozen solid. The driver had made that mistake, had driven his cement truck onto ice that seemed thick enough to support weight. It wasn't. The truck went through the ice 50 feet from shore, broke through into 8 feet of water, and started sinking. The driver got out, scrambled to safety, but the truck was going down and the quarry owner was looking at a major environmental disaster if 8 cubic yards of concrete leaked into the water. Ed got the call from Tom, who'd gotten it from Margaret Hartman, who'd gotten it from the quarry owner in a panic. "Ice is too thin for standard recovery equipment," Margaret told Ed over the phone. "My crane would go right through. I'd normally say wait for spring thaw, but the truck's leaking fuel and concrete. Environmental Protection Agency is involved. They need it out now." "How thin is the ice?" 4 inches in most places, 6 inches at the thickest. Not enough to hold a recovery crane. Maybe enough to hold your truck if you distribute the weight somehow. "Can't drive on ice that thin," Ed said. "But I can work from shore if I can get cable out to the truck." "How do you get cable across 50 feet of thin ice?" "Very carefully." Ed drove to the quarry in a snowstorm, set up the autocar on solid ground at the shore where the ice met land. Then he spent an hour constructing a cable delivery system using ropes and bamboo poles he'd brought for exactly this kind of situation. The poles were 12 feet long, light, designed to distribute weight across wide areas. Ed lashed them together into a ladder-like structure, attached his cable to the end, and very carefully, never stepping on the ice himself, pushed the structure out across the frozen surface. The ice creaked, cracked in places, but the distributed weight of the bamboo structure was light enough that the ice held. Ed fed cable through the structure until it reached the truck, then used a long pole with a hook to secure it to the truck's frame. The whole rigging process took 3 hours in falling snow, while the quarry crew stood on shore and watched like it was the most insane thing they'd ever seen. Then Ed got in the autocar and started pulling. The truck came out of the water, slowly dragging across ice that groaned and cracked, but held. Came sliding toward shore, leaving a trail of water and broken ice. When it reached solid ground, Ed disconnected, coiled his cable, and drove away, while the quarry crew stood in falling snow and stared. This time when they tried to pay him, Ed took nothing at all. "Why?" the quarry owner asked, holding out $500 that Ed wouldn't take. "This is your drama. You should be paid." "Don't need the money," Ed said. "You look like you need it more than I do." The quarry owner had looked at Ed like he was from another planet. Maybe he was. Maybe Ed was from a time when helping people mattered more than collecting payment, when doing good work was its own reward. March brought a semi that had rolled down an embankment on Route 19. The truck had gone off the road in icy conditions, rolled twice, and ended up 100 feet down in a ravine. The driver had survived with minor injuries, but the truck was wedged between trees in a position where standard recovery equipment couldn't reach it. Ed rigged from above using trees as anchor points, working angles that let the autocar's boom height pull from safety while the truck unwedged itself and climbed the embankment under cable guidance. April brought a crane that had tipped in soft spring ground, much like Tom's original problem, but in a different location. Ed pulled it using the same techniques, the same patient approach, the same understanding that power wasn't the answer when position and patience were available. May brought an excavator stuck in protected wetland where environmental regulations prohibited heavy equipment from entering. Ed worked from the wetland's edge, never crossing into protected territory while using his cable reach to extract the excavator without disturbing sensitive habitat. Each job was different. Each job was impossible by conventional standards. Each job, Ed's truck and Stefan's design and Ed's knowledge combined to solve what modern equipment couldn't. And each job word spread a little further. The story of the old man with the old wrecker who could pull equipment from situations where modern recovery companies feared to go. Ed never advertised, never sought work. The jobs found him. Through word of mouth, through contractors calling each other, through the network of construction and recovery people who all knew each other and all shared stories about the last resort wrecker. The truck you called when everything else had failed. Ed charged almost nothing. Sometimes a few $100s for fuel and wear on equipment. Often nothing at all. The money didn't matter to him. The pension from 42 years at Jones and Laughlin Steel was enough. The house was paid off. Mary's life insurance sat in the bank untouched because Ed had never needed it. What mattered was the work, the feeling of being useful, the knowledge that Stefan's truck was still doing what Stefan had built it to do. Margaret Hartman called after the excavator job in May. Ed, you need to charge real money for your work. What you're doing is worth thousands per job. You're leaving money on the table. Don't need money, Ed said. Same answer he'd given her before. Same answer he'd give anyone who asked. Then why do you do it? Ed had thought about that. Thought about it a lot during the quiet evenings in his kitchen, during the times when he sat at Stefan's table and remembered his father's hands building that table, remembered Mary painting the cabinets, remembered a life that had been full and was now mostly empty except for the work. Because I can, Ed said finally, because I have the ability to help people, and when you have that ability, you have the responsibility to use it. My father taught me that. Spent 40 years living it. I'm just trying to do the same. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then her voice came back softer. You remind me of William, my husband, before the business got big and complicated. Back when he just wanted to help people get unstuck. Back when it was about service instead of profit. Your husband sounds like he was a good man. He was. Margaret's voice carried weight grief that time had softened but not erased. I wish you could have met him. I think you two would have understood each other. After the call, Ed sat in his kitchen and thought about William Hartman, a man he'd never met but somehow knew. A man who'd built a recovery business because people needed help, who'd started with service and ended with profit and maybe regretted that transformation. Ed understood. The world pushed you toward profit, toward charging what the market would bear, toward treating helping people as a business transaction instead of a responsibility. Stefan had resisted that push for 40 years, had kept the Autocar services affordable, had helped for free when people couldn't pay, had believed that having the ability to help created the obligation to help. Ed was trying to honor that belief, trying to use Stefan's truck the way Stefan would have used it, trying to prove that 73 wasn't too old to matter. June brought the logging truck in the Appalachian Mountains, and June brought Derek Hammond back into Ed's life in an unexpected way. Ed was rigging the autocar on a narrow mountain road preparing to pull a loaded logging truck that had slid off the pavement and gotten wedged between trees when Derek's pickup pulled up. Derek got out looking uncomfortable in a way Ed hadn't seen at the January job site. Mr. Kokalchik, Ed looked up from securing a shackle. Derek. I came to, Derek struggled with the words, his engineer's precision failing him when it came to emotions. I came to say I was sorry for the way I acted at the Del Vecchio site, for what I said about your truck and your methods. I was wrong. Ed straightened carefully, his back protesting after an hour of bending and lifting. You weren't wrong about the engineering. You just weren't thinking about all the variables. I was arrogant, Derek said flatly. Thought I knew everything because I had the degree and the modern equipment. You proved that experience matters as much as education. Maybe more in some situations. Ed studied the younger man, saw genuine humility there, saw someone who'd been forced to reevaluate what he thought he knew. Engineering school teach you everything? Ed asked. No, it taught me theory, principles, how things should work under ideal conditions. But the real world isn't at ideal conditions. No, it's not. Derek looked at the logging truck wedged between trees. Can I ask how you know when to pull and when to wait, when the angle's right and when it's not? You don't have load calculators or computer models or any of the tools I was taught to rely on. I feel it, Ed said. Through the cable, through the truck. 42 years working in steel mills, you learn to sense stress in metal. Learn to know when something's about to give and when it'll hold. That's not engineering. No, Ed agreed. It's experience. Engineering tells you what should work. Experience tells you what will work. Both matter. You need both. Derek nodded, slowly processing that. Then he said something Ed hadn't expected. Will you teach me how to read ground conditions the way you do? How to feel stress in cable? How to solve problems the way you solve them? Ed looked at Derek. At the MIT graduate with the professional engineer's license, who'd spent 10 minutes being dismissive in January and had apparently spent 5 months thinking about what he'd seen. Why, Ed asked. Because I'm good at what I do, but watching you work made me realize I'm only good at one kind of problem. The problems that fit the engineering I was taught. You handle problems that don't fit any model I've seen. I want to be better than I am, and I think you can teach me how. Ed studied Derek's face, saw sincerity there, saw someone genuinely trying to improve, willing to admit he didn't know everything, humble enough to ask for help. All right, Ed said. You can help me with this logging truck. I'll explain what I'm doing and why, but you have to listen, not argue. Can you do that? Yes, sir. They worked together through the afternoon, Ed explaining his process, why he chose certain anchor points, how he evaluated ground stability, why cable angle mattered more than pulling force, how to read stress in rigging by sound and vibration instead of load sensors. Derek listened, asked questions, took notes in a small notebook he'd brought, treated Ed's knowledge with the same respect he'd give a textbook. Learning that experience and wisdom couldn't be downloaded or studied, only earned through years of doing the work. When they got the logging truck unstuck and back on the road, Derek shook Ed's hand. Thank you, Derek said. His voice was sincere. I learned better more today than I learned in 4 years of engineering school. Different things, but valuable things. Don't dismiss what school taught you, Ed cautioned. Engineering principles matter. You need the math and the theory. Just add what experience teaches. Make yourself more complete. Derek nodded. Can I call you for future jobs where unconventional approaches might help? If you need help, Ed said, I'll come. Derek left. Ed finished coiling his cable and securing his equipment, drove the autocar down the mountain road as afternoon turned to evening, and realized that he'd just done something else Stephen used to do. Not just recovery work, teaching, passing knowledge to the next generation, making sure what he knew didn't die with him. It felt good, felt like he was building something, not just maintaining it. Felt like maybe the Autocar's legacy could extend beyond Ed's lifetime if he taught others what Stefan had taught him. July brought a phone call that Ed had been half expecting and half dreading. Dad, Michael Kokalchik, Ed's son, 45 years old, living in Boston, working as an accountant, calling once a month with stiff conversations about nothing important. But this call was different. Ed heard it in Michael's voice immediately. Michael, how are you? I'm fine, Dad, but I need to talk to you about something. I've been hearing stories about you doing recovery work with Grandpa's wrecker. Ed closed his eyes. Of course, word traveled. Someone Michael knew in Pittsburgh had seen Ed working, had told Michael his 73-year-old father was wading into rivers and pulling equipment from mines. Some jobs here and there, Ed said carefully. Dad, you're 73 years old. You should be retired, relaxing, taking it easy, not risking your life pulling equipment. I am retired. This isn't work. It's helping people. It's dangerous. Michael's voice rose slightly, stress breaking through his usual control. What if you get hurt? What if something happens? You are up there alone with no one to help if things go wrong. What if the phrase that had defined their relationship since Mary died? What if you have a heart attack? What if you fall? What if you need help and there's no one there? Michael had been living with what if for 13 years, ever since he'd gotten the call that his mother was dying and had driven 5 hours from Boston only to arrive 30 minutes after Mary took her last breath. 30 minutes too late to say goodbye. Ed understood his son's fear, but understanding it didn't make it easier to address. I'm careful, Ed said. Being careful isn't enough. Dad, you could have a heart attack. You could fall. That equipment is 50 years old and you're operating it alone. Please, I'm begging you. Sell the wrecker. Take the money. Move into a retirement community where there are people around, where you're safe. I don't want a retirement community, and I'm not selling the Autocar. Why not, Dad? It's just a truck. It's not just a truck. Ed heard his own voice harden. It's your grandfather's work. It's what he built with his hands. It's his legacy. When I sell it, I'm selling the last piece of him that still does what it was made to do. Silence on the line. Michael, Ed said softer now, I know you worry. I know you're scared something will happen to me the way something happened to your mom. But I need you to understand something. For 7 years after your mother died, I sat in this house doing nothing. Felt useless. Felt like I was just waiting to die. Then I pulled that crane out of the river, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt like I mattered. Like I could still do something that helped people. But at what cost? Your safety, your life. I'm not going to live forever. You know that. I know that. But while I'm here, while I'm able, I want to be useful. The Autocar lets me be useful. And when I can't do it anymore, I'll stop. But not yet. More silence. Then Michael's voice quieter. You sound like Grandpa. I'll take that as a compliment. Michael sighed long and defeated. Just promise me you'll be careful. Please. I promise, Ukuki. Call me more often. Let me know you're okay. I will. After they hung up, Ed sat at his kitchen table for a long time thinking about his son, about the distance between them, geographical and emotional, about how that distance had started the day Mary died and Michael arrived too late. Some wounds never heal completely. You just learn to live with them. The summer of 1998 brought more bomb. Ed lost track of how many. A forklift that had tipped in a warehouse, a van that had rolled into a creek, construction equipment stuck in mud that had turned out to be softer than anyone expected. Each call, Ed fired up the Autocar. Each call, he drove out and did what needed doing. Each call, he proved that Stefan's engineering still worked, that old knowledge still mattered, that experience and patience could solve problems power couldn't touch. By August, people in Pittsburgh's construction and recovery industries had a name for Ed's operation. They called it the last resort wrecker, the truck you called when everything else had failed, when the situation looked impossible, when standard equipment and standard approaches wouldn't work. Margaret Hartman started joining Ed on some of the jobs. Not to help Ed, still worked alone, still insisted on doing the rigging himself, but to watch, to learn, to understand the methods Stefan had developed and Ed had refined. You're building a legacy, she told him in September, after they'd extracted an excavator from wetland without disturbing protected habitat. People talk about you, about the old man with the old truck who does the impossible. I'm not building anything, Ed protested, just using what my father built. It's more than that. You're proving something important, that old methods still work, that experience matters, that you don't need the newest, biggest, most expensive equipment to solve hard problems. That's valuable. That's worth preserving. Ed didn't know what to say to that. I've been thinking, Margaret continued, about what happens when you decide to stop. Not saying you should stop, just thinking about the future. Would you consider donating the Autocar to a museum The Heinz History Center has a Pittsburgh Industrial Heritage exhibit. Your truck would fit perfectly. You think people would want to see an old wrecker? I think people need to see it, need to remember that things used to be built to last, that craftsmanship mattered, that men like your father made things that are still working 70 years later. Margaret looked at Ed seriously. Your father's work deserves to be remembered. You deserve to be remembered. Ed looked at the autocar sitting on the job site with its boom-raised cable system rigged, everything ready to work. Looked at the machine Stefan had built by hand in a garage 70 years ago. I'll think about it, Ed said. That night, sitting in his kitchen, Ed did think about it. Thought about what would happen to the autocar when he couldn't use it anymore. When age finally made it impossible to do the work. When his body gave out for good. The truck would sit in the garage. Would sit there the way it had sat for 7 years before the crane job. Would eventually be sold for scrap or given away or forgotten. Unless Ed did something different. Unless he made sure Stefan's work was preserved. A museum made sense. Let people see what Stefan had built. Let them understand what was possible when a working man with skills and determination made something meant to last. Ed would think about it more, would talk to the History Center, would make sure that when his time was done, Stefan's work lived on. But not yet. Not while Ed could still drive the truck, still rig the cables, still do the work. Not while he was still useful. The call from Tom Delvecchio came on a Tuesday morning in November, 10 months after Ed had pulled Tom's first crane from the river. Ed, I need help. Tom's voice was tight, stressed. Ed heard something in it that made him sit up straighter. What's wrong? Small crane went into the river, same general area as last time, different spot. It's stuck and the recovery company can't get close enough. I know it's asking a lot. I know I already owe you more than I can repay, but I'll be there in an hour, Ed said without hesitation. He was pulling on his boots when the pain hit. Not pain. That word was too small. This was something else. Something that made pain look trivial. Like someone had reached into Ed's chest and grabbed his heart with a fist and squeezed. Squeezed until Ed couldn't breathe, couldn't stand, couldn't do anything but grab the kitchen table and try not to fall. The pain radiated, down his left arm making it go numb, up his neck into his jaw, through his chest like a hot knife. Heart attack. Ed knew it immediately. 42 years working in steel mills, you saw men have heart attacks. Knew what they looked like. Knew what the survivors said about how it felt. Ed managed to get his phone out of his pocket, managed to dial 911, managed to stay conscious long enough to give his address to the dispatcher, managed to unlock his front door so the EMTs could get in. Then he sat down on his kitchen floor back against the cabinets Mary had painted yellow and wondered if this was how it ended. 10 months of feeling useful again. 10 months of doing work that mattered. Then his heart gave out because he was 73 years old and bodies didn't last forever. Stefan's voice in his memory will work till hands can't hold it anymore. Ed's hands couldn't hold anymore. The EMTs arrived 12 minutes later, which felt like 12 hours. Found Ed conscious but barely ashen, sweating the classic presentation of cardiac arrest. They loaded him into the ambulance, and by the time they reached UPMC Presbyterian, the pain had faded into a cold numbness that felt worse. At the hospital, doctors and nurses moved fast. Tests, medications, a cardiac catheterization where they threaded cameras into Ed's heart through his wrist and found blocked arteries, narrowed passages, a heart that had been working on borrowed time. A doctor, maybe 40 years old, came to Ed's room afterward and explained that he'd had a moderate heart attack, that the blockage had been significant, but they'd cleared it, that he'd need medication and lifestyle changes and follow-up care. You're lucky, the doctor said. This could have been much worse. But Mr. Kokalchik, you need to understand that your heart was damaged. You'll recover, but you'll need to be careful. No strenuous activity, no heavy lifting, and no more of whatever you were doing when this happened. Can I make a phone call? Ed asked. Soon. We need to monitor you for... I need to call someone about a job. He's waiting for me. The doctor's face softened with understanding and pity. Mr. Kokalchik, you just had a heart attack. You won't be doing any jobs for a while. Probably never given the damage to your heart. You need to rest. You need to let your body heal. You need to accept that some things are over. Ed closed his eyes and thought about Tom standing by the river waiting for help that wouldn't come. Thought about the autocar sitting in his garage useless without someone to operate it. They let him make the call 30 minutes later. Tom answered on the first ring. Ed, where are you? Is everything okay? Hospital. Ed's voice came out weak. Had a heart attack. Can't make it. Silence. Then, Jesus, Ed, are you okay? Will be mine, but I can't help you. Not this time. Ed, forget the crane. I'll figure something out. You focus on getting better. Call Margaret Hartman at Hartman Recovery. Tell her I sent you. She knows the techniques. She can help. Ed. And Tom, I'm sorry. Don't apologize. You saved my company once. That's more than anyone could ask. Just get better. Ed hung up and lay back in the hospital bed, staring at the acoustic tile ceiling, feeling like he'd failed someone who trusted him. Feeling like maybe the doctor was right. Maybe some things were over. Maybe 73 was too old after all. Michael arrived the next morning looking exhausted and terrified. Must have driven through the night from Boston. Dad, you didn't need to come, Ed said, though he was glad his son was there. Of course I did. Michael pulled a chair close to the hospital bed. The doctor said it was moderate, that you'll recover with rest and medication. But Dad, then his voice cracked. You can't keep doing this. You can't keep pushing yourself. You can't keep doing recovery work. Your heart can't take it. Ed looked at his son, saw fear there, saw love, saw the same face that had looked at him when Michael was 15 and Ed had come home from the mill with a broken arm from a crane accident. The same worried expression Mary used to wear when Ed worked double shifts. I'm sorry, Ed said. Don't apologize. Just promise me you'll stop. Sell the wrecker. Please. Move somewhere with support. Let me help take care of you. Ed wanted to argue, wanted to say he wasn't done, wasn't ready to quit. But he'd just had a heart attack. Was lying in a hospital bed feeling weak and old and broken. What could he say that he'd ignore doctor's orders and keep doing dangerous work until his heart gave out completely? I'll think about it, Ed said quietly. Dad, I'll think about it, Ed repeated. I promise. That's all I can give you right now. Michael nodded, not satisfied, but accepting what he could get. They sat in silence for a while, father and son connected by blood and love, and all the space between Boston and Pittsburgh, between accountant and mill worker, between safety and risk. Then Michael said something that surprised Ed. I remember Grandpa building that truck. I was really young, maybe 5 or 6. You probably don't remember, but Mom took me to the garage to watch sometimes. Grandpa let me hold the welding torch once supervised, obviously, and I got to strike the arc. Just for a second, but it felt like magic. I remember thinking Grandpa was a wizard who could make metal do whatever he wanted. Ed hadn't known that. Hadn't known Michael had any memories of Stefan at all. Stefan had died when Michael was 18, but Michael had been away at college, and the relationship had never been close. He would have liked knowing you remembered that, Ed said. I think about it sometimes, about how he built something that lasted, something that still works 50 years later. Michael looked at Ed. You've kept it working, kept using it the way he meant it to be used. That's worth something, Dad. That matters. But you still want me to sell it. I want you alive more than I want the truck to keep working. Michael's voice was firm, certain. I'm sorry if that's selfish, but I already lost Mom. I'm not ready to lose you too. And if keeping you alive means that truck sits in a garage forever, then that's what needs to happen. Ed reached out and took his son's hand. Felt how much Michael's hands had grown since he was 5 years old watching Stefan weld. Felt the distance between them wider than the miles between Pittsburgh and Boston. I'm not going anywhere yet, Ed said, but I hear you. I'll be more careful, I promise. It was the best he could offer, and Michael, looking exhausted and frightened and loving, accepted. Odd. Ed spent 3 days in the hospital while doctors ran more tests and adjusted medications and explained what changes he'd need to make. Heart-healthy diet, regular exercise but gentle, stress reduction, follow-up appointments, and absolutely no strenuous activity, no heavy lifting, no recovery work. They released him on Friday with enough prescriptions to fill a pharmacy and instructions that felt like a prison sentence. Rest. Take it easy. Let your body heal. except that you're 73 years old and your heart has been damaged and some doors are closed now. Michael drove him home, helped him into the house, stayed through the weekend to make sure Ed was settled. Before leaving, Michael made Ed promise again, no more jobs, no more recovery work, no more risks. Ed promised, meant it. For exactly 4 weeks. The first month was the hardest Ed had experienced in his life. Harder than the months after Mary died. Harder than the years of wondering if he'd be useful again. Hard because now Ed knew what he was missing. He sat in his kitchen taking pills 3 times a day, walked slowly around his neighborhood building endurance at a pace that felt glacial, followed every doctor's order like a dutiful patient. The autocar sat in the garage. Ed could see it through his kitchen window. The boom visible over the garage door. He didn't go near it. The phone rang sometimes. Contractors asking for help. Companies with equipment stuck in impossible positions. Ed turned them all down. I can't. Medical issues. I'm sorry. Each time he said it, something inside him died a little more. Margaret Hartman came to visit in December, 2 weeks before Christmas. She brought soup her daughter had made and sat at Stefan's table with the comfortable ease of someone who'd seen hard times. How are you feeling? Old, Ed said. You haven't been old since I met you. I'm asking about your heart. Recovering. Doctors say I'll be fine as long as I don't do anything stupid. Margaret smiled slightly. Define stupid. Anything involving the autocar, apparently. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking coffee, two people who understood that some losses couldn't be replaced. I've been thinking about what you said, Ed continued, about donating the truck to the Heinz History Center. If I can't use it anymore, maybe it should go where people can see it, where it can teach something instead of sitting in my garage. You sure? No, Ed admitted, but it's better than letting it rust. Margaret nodded slowly. I have a friend who works at the History Center. I could make a call, but Ed, you don't have to decide right now. You're still recovering. Give yourself time. How much time do I have? I'm 73. Had a heart attack. Time's not exactly abundant. Time enough to heal. Time enough to think about what you want. After Margaret left, Ed sat in his kitchen, watching snow fall outside his window. Thought about the autocar in the garage, about Stefan's work sitting idle, about 10 months of feeling useful followed by a heart attack that ended everything. Thought about what the rest of his life looked like. Taking pills, walking slowly, following doctor's orders, sitting in this house waiting to die. It felt unbearable. January arrived bringing snow and cold, and the 1-year anniversary of the day Ed had pulled Tom's crane from the Allegheny River. 1 year since Ed had felt truly alive. The phone rang. Tom Del Vecchio. Ed, how are you feeling? Better. Doctors say I'm recovering well. Good. That's good. A pause. Listen, I'm calling because something happened. Small crane went into the river again. Different spot, different circumstances, but stuck just the same. And Ed, Tom's voice became uncertain. I know you can't do it. I know the doctors said no heavy work. But I thought maybe you could tell Margaret's crew how to approach it. You wouldn't have to do the work, just explain the approach. Ed's heart, the damaged, recovering one, beat faster. When, today if possible, ground's freezing hard tonight, and that might make things worse. Ed looked out the window at the garage, at the autocar sitting in shadows, at Stefan's work waiting. Doctors said no strenuous activity. Doctors said his heart needed rest. Doctors said one more heart attack might kill him. But Tom's crane was in the river, and Ed knew how to get it out. I'll be there in an hour, Ed said. Ed, I don't want you to risk. I won't pull it, Ed interrupted, but I can supervise. Tell your crew how to rig it. That's not strenuous, that's just talking. Which was a lie, and both of them knew it. But Tom said, thank you, and gave him the address, and Ed hung up and walked to his closet to find his work boots. One more time, just once more, to help Tom, to prove the autocar still worked, to feel useful one more time before age and damaged hearts made it impossible. Ed drove to the river knowing he was breaking his promise to Michael, breaking doctor's orders, risking the heart attack that might kill him. But he drove anyway, because Stefan's voice was in his head saying we'll work till hands can't hold it anymore. and Ed's hands could still hold. Just barely, but enough. Ed arrived at the river to find Margaret and her crew already there, a small crane submerged in water that looked even colder than it had been a year ago. Different spot, different crane, but fundamentally the same problem. Margaret took one look at Ed and said, "You shouldn't be here." "I'm not doing the work," Ed said. "Just advising." "Ed, you had a heart attack 2 months ago. Being here in the cold with the stress, this isn't what your doctors meant by taking it easy." "Margaret, that crane's in the river. Tom called me, and I know how to get it out. Now let me help before we waste more time arguing." She studied his face, then nodded. "All right, but the second I think you're overdoing it, you sit in a warm truck. Deal?" "Deal." For the next 2 hours, Ed directed the recovery operation, told Derek where to position equipment, explained rigging approaches, described angles and mechanical advantages, and how to work with the current instead of fighting it. Stood back and let younger men do the physical work while he supervised and guided and shared everything Stephen had taught him. His chest ached. His hands shook. The cold cut through his coat. But the crane came out of the river, clean and efficient, pulled by methods Stephen had designed 70 years ago, executed by people who'd learned to trust Ed's knowledge. After Tom tried to pay Ed $5,000, Ed took $500 for fuel and medication costs and left. That night, sitting in his kitchen, Ed felt the pain start in his chest again. Not as bad as November, but bad enough. A warning. A reminder that his heart wasn't healed, wasn't strong, wasn't capable of handling the stress Ed was putting it through. He took his medication, sat very still, let the pain fade, and thought seriously about what Michael and the doctors had been saying. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe 73 was old enough. Maybe he'd proven what he needed to prove. But February brought a call about a bulldozer in frozen ground, and Ed supervised. March brought an excavator in protected wetland, and Ed supervised. April brought a logging truck on a mountain road, and Ed supervised. Each time he stood back, let others do the physical work, followed doctor's orders about not lifting, not pulling, not pushing himself. Each time his chest ached, warning him, reminding him that his heart had limits, that those limits were closer than Ed wanted to admit. Each time he went anyway, because standing idle while people needed help felt worse than risking another heart attack, because Stephen's knowledge deserved to be used, because Ed didn't know how to be anything other than useful. Michael called in, his voice tight with frustration and fear. "Dad, Margaret told me you've been doing jobs again." "Supervising," Ed corrected, "not doing." "That's semantics. The doctor said rest, complete rest, not standing in the cold directing recovery operations." "Michael." "No, Dad, listen to me." Michael's voice broke slightly. "I love you, and I'm terrified I'm going to get a call one day saying you had another heart attack and this time it killed you. I can't lose you like I lost Mom. I can't handle the wondering, can't handle the fear every time my phone rings." Ed heard the fear in his son's voice, heard the same fear he had heard 13 years ago when Mary was dying and Michael was racing home from Boston, hoping to arrive in time, failing by 30 minutes. "I'll be more careful," Ed said. "That's not enough. I need you to stop completely." "I can't promise that." "Why not? Why is this so important that you'd risk your life for it?" Ed didn't have an answer that would satisfy Michael. Not one that made sense to someone who hadn't spent 42 years working steel, who hadn't felt the weight of being useless, who hadn't watched his father build something meant to help people. "Because it's what I can do," Ed said finally. "And when a man can't do what he's able to do, he stops being a man. He just becomes something waiting to die." Long silence on the line. Then Michael said something that changed everything. "I've been thinking about Grandpa a lot lately, about what he built, about why he built it." A pause, then. "I never told you this, but I was there the day he died. Not at the end, but earlier. It was Christmas break, 1976. I came home from college. I was 18. I went to the garage to see him, and he was working on the Autocar tuning something. And he looked so tired, Dad, so old. And he looked at me and said, 'Michael, remember that what a man builds outlasts him if he builds it right.'" Ed's throat tightened. He hadn't known Michael had seen Stephen that Christmas, Hadn't known they'd talked. He died 3 weeks later, Michael continued, and I remember thinking he knew. He knew he didn't have much time left, and he was making sure the truck would keep working after he was gone. A shaky breath. I think that's what scared me about you. Watching you use that truck the same way Grandpa did. Knowing that one day it's going to outlast you too, and I'm not ready for that. Michael. But I also know you're not going to stop. You're like him, too stubborn, too committed. So I'm asking if you're going to keep doing this, at least let me help. Let me come visit. Let me see what you're doing. Let me understand why it matters so much to you. Ed felt something break open in his chest that had nothing to do with his damaged heart. You'd want to do that? Yeah, Dad, I would. Michael came to Pittsburgh in June, spent a long weekend at Ed's house, and for the first time in years, father and son really connected. They went to the garage together on Saturday morning. Ed unlocked the door, swung it open, and let sunlight fall on the autocar. Michael stood looking at it for a long time. Then he walked around it slowly the way Ed always did, checking welds and frame rails, and the boom that rose 24 feet into the air. It's beautiful, Michael said quietly, in a weird industrial kind of way, like functional art. Your grandfather would have liked hearing that. Tell me about it, about how he built it. So Ed did. Spent an hour explaining Stefan's design philosophy, how the boom worked, how mechanical advantage through blocks multiplied force, how the height let them work from safety, how every weld and every bolt had a purpose. Michael listened, asked questions, touched the welds Stefan had made with his own hands 70 years ago, connected with his grandfather's work in a way he never had when Stefan was alive. Can I learn, Michael asked, to operate it? Why? Because it's part of our family, part of what Grandpa built and you've maintained. I want to understand it, want to know how to use it if it's ever needed. Ed studied his son's face, saw sincerity there, saw something else too, something he couldn't quite name. Connection, maybe. Purpose. All right, Ed said, I'll teach you. They spent Sunday at the garage, Ed explaining the controls, the winch operation, how to read cable tension by sound and feel. Michael learning, taking notes, asking the detailed questions an accountant would ask about something technical. Monday they drove to a job site where Margaret's crew was working. Ed introduced Michael to Derek, to Margaret, to Tom Delvecchio. Michael watched his father supervise a recovery operation, watched how the crew listened to Ed's directions, watched how they trusted his judgment despite his age, despite his recent heart attack, because his knowledge was proven. That night over dinner at the same Lawrenceville diner where Ed had met Margaret, Michael said, I get it now. Why you do this. It's not about the truck or the money or even the helping, really. It's about mattering, about being the person people trust when everything else fails. Yeah, Ed said. That's it exactly. But Dad, you know you can't do this forever, right? I know. So what happens when you stop? Who keeps this knowledge alive? Ed had thought about that. Thought about it every time he supervised a shift, every time he explained his methods to Derek or Margaret's crew, every time he realized he was teaching instead of just doing. Nobody, Ed said honestly. The kind of work I do, the way I do it, that's disappearing. Modern equipment's getting better. Recovery techniques are improving. In 10 years, there probably won't be situations that need the Autocar's specific approach. That makes you sad, Michael observed. Makes me aware that time moves on. What was necessary once becomes obsolete. That's not sad, that's just reality. But grand. Pa's truck shouldn't be forgotten. No, Ed agreed. It shouldn't. That's why I've been thinking about what Margaret suggested, donating it to the Heinz History Center. Let people see what men like your grandfather built. Let them understand that craftsmanship used to mean something. Michael nodded slowly, then said, I want to help. When you're ready to donate it, I want to be part of that. Want to make sure the story gets told right. Make sure people understand what Grandpa did and why it mattered. I'd like that, Ed said, and meant it. July brought another call that would change everything. Ed was in his kitchen sorting pills into daily containers when the phone rang. Tom Delvecchio and his voice had an urgency that made Ed stand up straight despite his aching knees. Ed, I need help, real help. Big crane went into the river at the bridge site. Same general spot as 2 years ago. Ed felt his pulse quicken, felt his damaged heart beat faster. How bad? Bad. Current stronger than it was in January. Cranes sliding deeper. If we don't get it out soon, it'll be completely submerged and we'll never recover it. What does Margaret say? She's here. Her crew's trying, but they can't get close enough. Ground's worse than last time. Maybe worse than any time. Ed, it's the same problem we had before, but magnified. Ed looked out at the garage, at the autocar sitting in shadows, at Stefan's work waiting for one more job. Doctors had said one more heart attack might kill him. Michael had begged him to stop. His body was 74 years old and damaged and running on borrowed time and medication. But Tom's crane was in the river, and the autocar could get it out. I'll be there in an hour, Ed said. Ed, you don't have to. I'll be there, Ed repeated and hung up. He stood in his kitchen for a long moment looking at the pill containers on the table. Then he put on his boots, his coat, his tool belt. Everything exactly where it had been for 50 years. Called Michael's number. Got voicemail? Michael, it is your dad. I'm about to do something you're not going to like. But I need you to know I'm not doing it because I don't care about your feelings or because I don't value my life. I'm doing it because there's a job that needs doing, and I'm the one who can do it. If something happens, his voice caught, then steadied. If something happens, know that I love you. Know that I'm proud of the man you became. Know that I kept your grandfather's promise. The truck did its job. Tell that story. Make sure people understand what it meant. He hung up, went to the garage, fired up the autocar, and drove toward the river one last time. The scene at the bridge site was chaos. Margaret's crew had 2 recovery cranes positioned but couldn't get close enough to the water. The ground was even softer than 2 years ago. Spring floods had undermined the bank. The crane in the river was sliding slowly but visibly deeper into current that looked stronger and angrier than Ed remembered. Ed pulled up in the autocar and Margaret ran over her face, a mixture of relief and worry. Ed, no, you can't do this. Your heart. My heart's my problem, Ed said, climbing down from the cab carefully. That crane's yours. Let me help. Ed, if you have another heart attack out here, then I have another heart attack. Margaret, we both know I'm the only one here who can rig this pull safely. We both know the autocar's the only equipment light enough to anchor on solid ground far enough back. And we both know if we waste time arguing, that crane's going to sink too deep to save. She stared at him, saw the determination in his face, made a decision. Tell me what you need. Ed spent 30 minutes surveying the site, his chest already aching from the stress and the cold. The ground was worse than he'd ever seen it. The river was angrier. The crane was bigger. Everything about this job was harder than anything Ed had done before. But the principles were the same. The geometry was the same. Stefan's design would work if Ed could hold himself together long enough to make it work. He explained to Derek and Margaret's crew how to position the snatch blocks, where to anchor, what angles to pull from. Then he climbed back into the autocar and positioned it exactly where he needed it, 100 feet back from the water, on ground that was firm but barely. The crew rigged the cables following his directions. Ed supervised every connection, every knot, every anchor point. Checked them twice because this was it. This was the job that would either prove Stefan's design one final time or prove that Ed had waited too long, pushed too hard. Margaret appeared at his window. When you start pulling, if anything looks wrong, you tell me immediately. And Ed, if anything feels wrong, if your chest hurts, if you feel dizzy, you stop. Promise me. I'll be careful, Ed said, which was a lie, and they both knew it. Ed started the winch. The cable went taut with that familiar sound gears meshing, power transferring through mechanical advantage that Stefan had designed 70 years ago. The crane shifted in the water. Ed worked the way he always had. Patient, methodical, pulley hold reposition. But his chest was hurting now, not the gentle ache of exertion, but something sharper, more urgent. He ignored it. 20 minutes in, the boom broke free from mud. The crane lurched forward. 30 minutes in, Ed's chest felt like someone was driving nails through it. His vision blurred at the edges. His hands shook on the controls. He kept pulling. 40 minutes in, the crane was on dry land, and Ed knew with absolute certainty that he was dying. He shut down the winch, set the brake, tried to climb out of the cab, made it halfway down before his legs gave out completely. He fell, caught himself on the autocar's frame. The pain in his chest became something beyond pain, became a force that stopped time and breath and thought. Ed slid to the ground, one hand still gripping the frame Stefan had built, and heard voices shouting around him. Margaret's face above him, pale and frightened. Someone saying, call an ambulance. Someone else saying, hold on, Ed, just hold on. But Ed wasn't listening to them. He was listening to Stefan's voice, rough with accent, and Millwork saying what he'd said 1,000 times. Built by hands, Eddie. We'll work till hands can't hold it anymore. Ed's hands couldn't hold anymore. But the job was done. The crane was out. Stefan's truck had proven itself one last time. Ed closed his eyes and let go. He woke up in a hospital room with Michael sitting beside the bed holding his hand. Dad, Michael's voice was rough like he'd been crying. Thank God. How long? Ed's voice came out as barely a whisper. 2 days. You had a massive heart attack. They had to. Michael's voice broke. They had to restart your heart. Twice. In the ambulance. The doctor said another 5 minutes and you'd have been gone. Ed processed that slowly. 2 days. Dead for how long? Minutes brought back. The crane. Michael stared at him. Seriously, Dad, you almost died and you're asking about the crane. Did we get it out? Michael smiled despite himself, despite the fear and exhaustion on his face. Yeah, you got it out. Tom said it was the cleanest recovery he'd ever seen. Said you did what everyone else said was impossible. Good, Ed said and closed his eyes. Dad, the doctors said you can't do any more recovery work, ever. Your heart can't take it. If you try again, you will die. Do you understand that? Ed opened his eyes, looked at his son, saw love and fear and exhaustion all mixed together. I understand, Ed said. I'm done. Promise me. I promise. Well, and this time Ed meant it. This time he'd gone as far as his heart would let him go. This time there was no more room for one more job, one more pull, one more time. This time was the end. Recovery took 3 months, long months of medication and cardiac rehabilitation and slowly rebuilding strength. Michael stayed the first 2 weeks, then flew back to Boston with Ed's promise to call every day, to follow every doctor's order, to accept that some things were over. Ed kept his promise, took his pills, attended rehab, walked slowly around his neighborhood, followed the meal plan, rested, and thought about the autocar sitting in his garage doing nothing. Margaret visited every week, brought updates on jobs her crew was handling, told Ed that Derek had started teaching his recovery teams the techniques Ed had shown him. That word had spread about the old man who'd pulled one final crane before his heart gave out. That people were calling it legendary, the kind of story that would get told for decades. You've changed things, Margaret told him in September. People talk about you, about what you proved, about how old knowledge and old equipment solved problems modern approaches couldn't touch. That matters, Ed. That's a legacy. Maybe, Ed said. In October, Michael came back to Pittsburgh, brought his daughter, Elena, Ed's granddaughter, who was 8 years old and had never seen the autocar. They went to the garage together on a Saturday morning. Ed unlocked the doors, and Elena gasped when she saw the truck. It's huge, 24 feet to the top of that boom, Ed said. Your great-grandfather built it with his hands. Every weld, every piece, all by hand. Elena walked around it slowly, touching the frame, looking up at the boom with wonder. It's like a superhero truck. Kind of, Ed agreed. Why doesn't it work anymore? It works fine, Ed said. I'm the part that doesn't work anymore. Because your heart's tired. Yeah, sweetheart, because my heart's tired. Elena looked at him seriously with her mother's eyes. Grandpa, if you can't use it, what happens to the superhero truck? Ed looked at Michael, then at Elena, then at the autocar that Stefan had built and Ed had kept running and that now sat silent. I think, Ed said slowly, it's time for the superhero truck to retire too. Go somewhere people can see it and learn from it. Like a museum. A museum. Elena's face lit up. Then other kids could see it and learn about great-grandpa Stefan. Exactly. That's good, Elena said. Then the superhero truck can teach people forever. Out of the mouths of children, Ed thought. Teaching people forever. That was better than sitting in a garage. better than eventually being scrapped or forgotten. That was a legacy worth building. The donation ceremony happened in November, 2 years and 1 month after Ed had pulled Tom's first crane from the Allegheny. The Heinz History Center prepared a space in their Made in Pittsburgh exhibit. Margaret arranged transport. The autocar was positioned carefully, boom raised to full height, looking exactly like it had looked at 100 job sites over 50 years. Ed attended the ceremony with Michael and Elena. Tom Delvecchio came. Derek Hammond came. Patricia Ross from the mining company came. The quarry owner came. Margaret and her entire crew came. People Ed had helped over 2 years, people whose equipment he'd pulled from impossible situations, people who understood what the autocar represented. The curator gave a speech about industrial heritage and working-class ingenuity and machines that outlasted the men who built them. Then they asked Ed to say something. He stood in front of the autocar Stephen's truck and looked at the crowd gathered. My father built this truck in a garage 77 years ago because he wanted to help people who couldn't afford help, Ed said. His voice was steady despite his damaged heart. Despite his age, despite everything. He didn't build it to make money or to be famous. He built it because he had the skills and the tools and the knowledge, and he believed that when you can help someone, you should help them. That was his philosophy. That was how he lived. Ed touched the autocar's frame, felt cold metal under his hand one last time. This truck outlasted him. Outlasted my wife, Mary. Outlasted the steel mills where we both worked. And now it's going to outlast me too. But that's okay. That's what things built, right? Do they keep working long after the builders are gone? They teach long after the teachers are silent. He looked at Michael, at Elena, at faces young and old who'd come to honor a truck and the men who'd used it. I'm glad it'll be here, where people can see what my father built, where children can learn that things used to be made to last, where anyone who wants to understand what craftsmanship meant can see it with their own eyes. The curator thanked him. People applauded, and Ed stood watching them photograph the autocar, watching children touch the boom Stephen had welded, watching his father's work live on in a way that mattered. Spring came to Pittsburgh in 2004. Ed was 79 now, his heart damaged beyond full repair, but still beating, his body worn, but still moving. He sat in his kitchen on Saturday mornings drinking coffee, watching birds at the feeder Mary had put up 30 years ago, thinking about how strange it was to still be alive. The phone rang. Derek Hammond. Ed, how are you feeling? Old, tired, alive. What do you need, Derek? There's a situation. School bus went off the road in Butler County, hanging on the edge of a collapsed bridge. They need to stabilize it before they can get the kids out, but standard equipment's too heavy to risk on the damaged structure. Ed's pulse quickened instinctively, then he remembered. He couldn't do it. His heart wouldn't let him. Derek, I can't. The doctors... I know, I'm not asking you to do it. I'm asking if Michael could. Ed went very still. What? I've been training with Margaret's crew, learning the techniques you taught me. And I realized something. The autocar's in the museum, but those techniques aren't locked away. They're real. They work. And if Michael knows how to operate the truck, if he learned from you, like you learned from Stephen, then in an emergency, the History Center would let us use it. They've already said as much. The truck's still operational. It just needs an operator. Ed sat processing this, thought about Michael's hands on the autocar's controls, thought about Stephen teaching Ed to weld, thought about legacy and knowledge passing between generations. Let me call you back, Ed said. He sat for a long time, then dialed Michael's number. Dad, hi, I was just about to call you. Michael, I need to ask you something. Okay. How would you feel about learning to operate the autocar, really learning it, well enough to use it in emergencies? Silence. Then, what do you mean? Ed explained to Rick's call. Explain the idea. Explain that it wouldn't be regular work, just emergency situations where the autocar's specific capabilities were needed, where modern equipment couldn't safely operate. But it would mean coming to Pittsburgh regularly, Yannick, Ed finished, learning the rigging, understanding the truck the way your grandfather and I understood it, learning the knowledge so it doesn't die when I die. More silence. Then Michael said something Ed hadn't expected. I've been thinking about early retirement. The firm's offering a buyout package. I've been wondering what I'd do with actual free time that's mine instead of the firm's. A pause. This might be my answer, Dad. Learning what Grandpa and you knew. Keeping that knowledge alive. Yeah, I'd like that. Michael came to Pittsburgh in April. For 2 months, Ed taught his son everything Stefan had taught him. How to read ground conditions, how to rig cable systems for maximum mechanical advantage, how to feel tension in steel by sound and vibration instead of load sensors, how to work with weight instead of fighting it. They sat in Ed's kitchen, drawing diagrams, drove to the History Center, and studied the Autocar with the curator's blessing. Talked for hours about angles and leverage and the physics of recovery work that couldn't be reduced to equations. In June, Derek called with a small job. Nothing dangerous, just a car stuck in a position where standard towing wouldn't work safely. The History Center released the Autocar for the day. Michael, supervised by Ed and Derek, rigged the pull, operated the winch, recovered the car cleanly. When it was done, Michael stood next to the Autocar, hands shaking slightly, and said, "Now I understand why you did this, why Grandpa built this. It's not about the equipment or the technique. It's about knowing you can solve problems other people can't. About mattering." "That's exactly it," Ed said. Ed Kokalchik died in his sleep on November 14, 2004, 3 weeks after his 79th birthday. His heart, damaged by 2 heart attacks and 42 years of mill work and 79 years of living, simply stopped. Michael found him the next morning peaceful in his bed, the way Mary had looked when the cancer took her. The funeral was at the same Polish church where Ed and Mary had married. 200 people came. Steel workers who remembered Stefan. Contractors Ed had helped. People whose equipment he'd pulled from impossible situations. Margaret Hartman, Derek Hammond, Tom Delvecchio. The Autocar, by special permission from the Heinz History Center, was driven to the funeral by Michael. It sat in the parking lot during the service boom, raised to the sky, a monument to 3 generations of men who'd believed in building things that lasted. At the reception, Derek approached Michael. "Your father changed my life, made me better at what I do. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Michael said. Tom came over. "Your father saved my company, maybe saved my marriage. I wouldn't have the life I have without him." Margaret hugged Michael. "Your father was one of the finest people I ever knew, and your grandfather must have been remarkable to raise a man like that." "They both were," Michael said. The Autocar returned to the History Center. A new placard was installed. "In emergency situations where this equipment's unique capabilities are required, it remains operational through the Kokalchik family." In 2005, Michael got a call. School bus on collapsed bridge. The situation Derek had described a year earlier. Michael, with Derek supervising, brought the Autocar out. Rigged the stabilization exactly as Ed had taught him. Held the bus steady while firefighters extracted 12 children safely. When it was over, Michael stood next to the Autocar and felt his father's presence like a physical thing. "We're keeping the promise, Dad," he said quietly. "The truck's still doing its job." Years later, when Michael was teaching his grandson about recovery work and problem solving, the boy asked why it mattered. Michael looked at the Autocar in the museum, still strong 70 years after Stefan built it. "Because knowing how to solve hard problems with simple tools makes you better at solving any problem. And because your great-great-grandfather built something that outlasted him, and your great-grandfather kept it working, and now it's our job to make sure what they knew doesn't disappear." What did they know? That machines don't make legacies. People do. Machines just carry them forward. The boy thought about that, then touched the Autocar's frame respectfully. "Can I learn?" "Yeah," Michael said. "You can learn." The Autocar DC-100 still sits in the Heinz History Center today, fully operational, ready for emergencies, a monument not to machines but to the men who built them and used them and taught others how to use them. A monument to the promise that helping people matters more than profit. That knowledge passed between generations never truly dies. That things built right outlast the builders. Stefan Kokalchik's work did exactly what he built it to do. It helped people. It lasted. And 77 years later, it still teaches the lesson that craftsmanship and service and stubborn determination to do good work can change lives and create legacies that never end.